Thank you. And my grateful greetings to Your Eminence Cardinal Turkson, to you, President Helen, and to each participant in the Plenary Assembly on Disability, and for your thoughtful papers. And I want to thank my husband also, who's with us today, because it's only really because of him that I can be here, because it's his birthday, a very special birthday. And and he's been my support throughout my life, my family life, and my working life. In the spirit of nothing about us without us, my speech will include the voices of some disabled people that I know well. And from their stories, and is my, presentation showing? Because I can't see it. No? Is the presentation, okay. But anyway, from the stories, the voices of some disabled people that I know well, and from their stories, and from my academic, clinical, and parliamentary work, I'm going to suggest some possible modifiable determinants of disability. The people I'm going to speak about are living remarkable lives, but all have faced barriers and challenges. Some have at times been let down by a lack of political charity when the design and delivery of public services fall short. But all have thrived when their own gifts have been recognised and their value affirmed. So, are the slides now showing? Right. Okay. I'm going to talk about a lady called Alexis Quinn. She's an autistic Cambridge University graduate and the author of a book called Unbroken, which tells us, and she's going to tell us in a video, if it can be shown, just how she escaped from detention in a psychiatric hospital in the United Kingdom and fled to Nigeria for safety. And what I really would like to do now is to show you a short video of Alexa speaking.
The biggest thing for me is the kind of systemic othering that's had the biggest impact on me, and I've had a lot of things happen, and that started when I was very young, when I wasn't meeting those milestones, and I'm a psychotherapist, and I understand that those communications, even as a baby, when Alexis isn't doing this and Alexis isn't doing that on time, and Alexis is a bit odd, Alexis moves too much, Alexis doesn't sleep, Alexis doesn't, the way that gets internalized, and you come to identify with all these things you do and you don't do, which aren't okay, which people don't like about you. And as you grow and as you enter schools, it's actually those things that people focus on. They don't focus on the other things that you could be or the other things that you are. They don't focus on your humanity, your humanness, your kindness, your ability to empathize or be gentle, or any sense of mastery that you might have over particular niche topics that you're interested in. In fact, those niche topics become a topic for complaint that you do them too much. And then as you continue to grow, children start to learn that you're weird and odd and they don't want to be with you. And then it's really difficult to have any kind of relationships or any kind of connection, and you feel lonely and you feel isolated and you don't feel welcome anywhere. And actually, you're not welcome anywhere. That's the truth of it.
So what could be done to remove some of those barriers? These are the determinants, if you like, of disability, which make you more anxious, make you feel less welcome. What should be done? What could be done?
What we need to do is we need to show love to people and interest in people and kindness to people. And this is a lot more difficult than it sounds. I'm a mother. I have two neurodivergent children. My daughter, this is her art behind me. What I do for her is I proudly display her work. I give her a sense of mastery over her environment, and I promote this. And for my son, when he wants to hit or spit or kick, I cuddle him. And when he wants to scream and shout, I love him. And instead of punishing him, I try and understand what it is, his distress that's going on for him. You know, I think when we get that understanding, when society has that understanding, and when we can show that love and compassion for all different types of people, however they express themselves or whichever ways of being, that's going to be a cultural and systemic change that means everybody can be included and valued in society.
Okay, so Alexis had done nothing wrong, but she was detained in hospital for 3 years until she escaped. She was overwhelmed after the birth of her first child and the death of her brother in the same week. Traumatic life events are even harder for autistic people. And Alexis joined my government-appointed independent panel. Our task was to find a way to reduce the use of solitary confinement and the kind of social death that Alexis herself had experienced. So in November last year, after 4 years' work, we produced a report called My Heart Breaks, There is No Therapeutic Benefit for People with a Learning Disability and Autistic People from Solitary Confinement, basically. The government issued a response at the same time, and the essence of the report is that the life stories and needs of autistic people and of people with intellectual disabilities who are detained in mental health settings are very poorly understood. Hospital admissions make things worse. Previous trauma histories and lengths of stay are much longer, an average of 6 years in England compared with 1 month for an admission for psychosis. And importantly, we found that the relational nature of care and treatment and rehabilitation was not understood, that services were relying on crisis responses rather than supporting people to flourish in ways that have personal meaning. And today, there are still 115 autistic people and people with intellectual disability being detained in solitary confinement in England, and sometimes the conditions are very poor. So in our current, less connected world, our intolerance of other people's differences and difficulties contributes to their exclusion from ordinary life. In the 1980s, I helped to close a long-stay mental handicap hospital. The picture is on the slide. And in the community, we tried to develop better psychosocial support. I taught trainee psychiatrists to see and understand each patient as an individual, not as a diagnosis. And my ethnographic research with social anthropologist Dr. Jane Hubert, with men in a locked ward, found similar dehumanizing impacts. They were considered a risk to others, but they were the ones who were at risk. Years later, a former trainee of mine, now retired, confessed that she thought I was on a different planet. She was sure that a very distressed man called Kevin could never be discharged. But now she admitted Kevin is living contentedly in a flat in the local town and selling his own paintings. She asked him why had he behaved in such a challenging way in the hospital. He simply said, "I didn't like being locked up." His story was that he'd been bullied and abused at school. His distressed behaviour had led to his exclusion. Then his father had died, and his mother couldn't cope. Hospital admission was offered to give her a rest, but he never went home. This is a typical scenario. It begins with one exclusion, one loss, one abusive event, and then another, which can eventually lead to permanent exclusion from society. Research into the impact of adverse childhood experiences shows how cumulative events have long-lasting effects on both physical and mental health and life expectancy. There are, of course, many protective factors, but the things that tip the balance towards resiliency are in short supply for far too many people, even in wealthier communities. And I've put up on the slide a manifesto, which I call the Belong Manifesto, which is about the things that we all need in our lives. My eldest daughter, Catherine, is also a psychiatrist. She focuses on public mental health. for young families, trying to build resilience and community connection and to build our communities for the future. She consults to local authority, voluntary and health services to build their confidence in understanding and responding to the wide variety of needs in their community. One suggested action I've put up on the slide. Basically, it's about the things we all need in life. Many of them are set out in international treaties. But the use of the word safe, which is often used, is questioned in a recent blog by Bryony Sannon called Rewriting Social Care. She said, being safe is not a freedom in its own right. It's what allows us to get on with the rest of our lives. Sadly, current care systems, where they exist, are simply a safety net, not a springboard, not supporting people to flourish. And too often our practice focuses on keeping people alive, not ensuring that people thrive. My autistic son Nigel also has an intellectual disability. The list of things he can't do is long. We prefer to celebrate what he can do, but it's true, his cognitive and executive impairments do get in the way. That's rather a good picture of him on the screen. Perhaps if he hadn't had a family who tried to include him in everything, if he hadn't had speech therapy every school day for many years as a child, he might be a non-speaking 50-year-old in a long-stay hospital ward like the one that Kevin lived in, if he hadn't been allowed to take risks. My son inspired my career, and as we will hear, he inspired his sisters too. Nigel won a leadership award 2 years ago for inspiring a new communication tool that I developed in my university role. Initially, it was used to explain my clinical research to my patient group, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We created word-free stories with my son's help to explain the difficult life events that my research team was studying. And these included issues such as the emotional impact of the death of a parent or of sexual abuse. And they're stories designed to build people's emotional resilience through honest storytelling. Therapeutic, if you like, but without needing specialist skills to share. Today, there are 80 stories told in pictures, without any words, no longer a university pilot, but an established charitable publisher. And because they're word-free and because human emotions are universal, our stories can be used around the world. For example, our COVID and refugee stories. And they're being read in book clubs across England. During the pandemic, the book clubs went online. And the technical and moral support for Nigel's first Zoom book clubs was provided by his sister Emily, a lifesaver for him, although his world has still not recovered fully from the pandemic. And here again on the screen, some pictures of those attempts at having a book club online, reading a book in pictures. Okay. So Emily is my third child, an autistic woman diagnosed in her 40s and with mobility problems because of long-standing chronic fatigue syndrome. Her MA in pastoral theology focused on inclusion for disabled children and adults in church, using multi-sensory initiatives such as Messy Church. And she was drawn to this research in part because of what she had learned as Nigel's sister and his part-time PA.
Growing up with a disabled brother, we met a lot of other disabled people as a family, and it was just normal part of life. It wasn't an unusual thing. It's only as an adult that I've realised that lots of people don't have that experience. But I've also learned a lot about how to help people to be included in events. Since 2008, I've been running a retreat weekend at Worth Abbey for people of all abilities. We want everybody to help each other. It's not about serving disabled people or people with additional needs. I speak to each person that's coming about what their particular needs are, and then I find ways to support those needs, and I tailor the activities to the needs of all the people coming. The other thing I do is I make my retreats multi-sensory, because I find that it makes it more easy for people who find words difficult. So you have hands-on activities, you have music, signing, moving the body in different ways, dancing, art. When I did my master's in theology at the Margaret Beaufort Institute in Cambridge, I decided to do my dissertation about how multisensory elements help people with additional needs to participate more fully in prayer and worship. So I spoke to people who came on my retreats. I did research with Mercy Church, which do a lot of multisensory activities with people of all ages. And I just found out some really interesting things. I found out that people felt their needs were more met. They learned how to go more deeply into prayer, because it wasn't all about the head, it was about the body. I had an autistic lady who said that she had learned that multisensory prayer, praying with the body, listening to music, signing, helped her to go much more deeply in prayer than simply reading and praying with words. For myself, I've often found it hard to focus on prayer and in the more traditional senses, and practical and hands-on things have often helped me to focus better, which is one of the reasons why I do this with other people, because I found it helpful myself as an autistic woman.
My daughters had the chance as children to share holidays with other families with disabled children, something my husband and I organised for many years. Well, I was asked to talk to you about my family. But many people who work with people with intellectual developmental disabilities have an affected family member or friend. Before my son was born and diagnosed, I knew nothing. As a doctor, I'd learnt about genetic syndromes, the tragedy model of brain injury caused by accident or disease. I didn't learn what it is like for an individual to be born with or to acquire an impairment, to have to face the environmental barriers which would exclude and disable them. I didn't find the various models of disability helpful in making sense of my family experience, and I didn't learn about the impact of trauma. When I became a member of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, nobody seemed aware of the high prevalence of abuse amongst disabled children and adults, although the reality is that they are at greater risk, partly because they're invisible, because of the power imbalances in nearly all of their relationships. And of course, abuse is always an abuse of power. The possibility that disabled children and adults might be abused is still not on the agenda of most safeguarding officers. So here's a suggested action, and it would be that safeguarding officers really focus on this group of people too. The point here is that our lack of familiarity with people who are different may be one of the most modifiable environmental barriers, one of the most modifiable determinants of disability that leads to exclusion. One suggested action might be to educate our priests and deacons about the importance of inclusion, not as an academic module, but a key practical component in seminary, getting to know a disabled person, their family, and keeping in touch for life, as does one of our bishops in England, who knew our son when he was a seminarian. And actually, as a young priest, had breakfast every Thursday morning with my son to keep in touch with him, and invited him to his installation as a bishop. So some people who have a disabled family member become leaders in movements for inclusion. Social scientist Dr. David Towell wrote the groundbreaking paper in Ordinary Life, published by the King's Fund in 1980, and kick-started the Ordinary Life movement. His sister was admitted to institutional care the day before he was born at the end of World War II. We could offer leadership support to family members, involve them in service design. 2022, I sponsored the Down Syndrome Act during its passage through the House of Lords. Some members of the House argued that no child should be born with Down syndrome, that we should aim to discard or eliminate people with Down syndrome before birth, as has reportedly been done in Iceland. People with Down syndrome listening to this are angry that other people want to eliminate them. Others with Down syndrome feel guilty, believing they are a burden. I call it remorse for being, the experience of realizing that others wished you were dead. The Down Syndrome Act recognizes people with Down syndrome as a specific minority group, and it legislates for their social care needs to be met. It is the first such legislation in the world, and the supporting guidance was drafted with the help of people with Down syndrome. There's one suggested action would be leadership support for disabled persons, persons with disabilities, so that their voices are heard at the policy level. And as this lovely YouTube clip suggested on World Down Syndrome Day, if they assume that I can, maybe I will. There are some more poignant examples from my family. In 2005, my youngest daughter, Abigail, just pregnant with her second child, was stabbed by a stranger whilst walking home with our 2-year-old grandson. She survived, albeit with a high-level spinal injury. The national media treated her story as tragic, as did some of her social circle. For us, for her husband, her small child, her family and friends, she was still Abigail. She was alive. The main barriers, apart from financial ones to pay for care and support, were attitudinal ones, alongside the reality that activities of everyday life would take longer. Onlookers were puzzled by our acceptance of her new condition and saw her as a saint. Abigail says of herself that her condition has brought unimaginable gifts. She doesn't regret anything, but she recognizes that having been brought up with a disabled brother gave her a huge advantage. She could imagine her life as a disabled woman, but the health and care system didn't have the imagination to see how her life could be. They offered her long-term care in a nursing home, despite the fact that she was pregnant. They couldn't begin to imagine her life as a mother, as a teacher of her homeschool children, as a catechist, as a poet. Her then 2-year-old child is now 20. The baby she was carrying as a talented young filmmaker, and she later had a third child. For her injury, she'd worked in an all-age school in an African country with children with special educational needs and disabilities. There'd been no disabled children in the school until shortly before she arrived. An appeal to the children during school assembly produced information about 120 disabled brothers and sisters and neighbours, and soon 70 of them were being brought into school. The remainder received home visits from a teacher. Their parents or other caregivers learnt useful skills and were less likely to abandon their children. A few years later, the home visit programme was extended to 1,000 children, children no longer out of sight and out of mind, no longer hidden out of shame. What if all school children were educated alongside their disabled brothers and sisters? Well, child abandonment of disabled children is more likely in poorer communities, and of the 8 million children living in orphanages worldwide, a large minority are disabled, but not actually orphaned. And during periods of conflict or natural disaster, disabled family members are at even greater risk of abandonment. The charity Hope and Homes for Children works to develop family support to enable all children to grow up in a family. And this was also one of the recommendations in my report to the World Health Organization, adopted by all 52 ministers of health in Europe in 2012, called Better Health, Better Lives. Could religious orders running orphanages around the world retrain to develop family-based support and care for all disabled children referred to them, rather than taking them into an orphanage, into an institution? Finally, there are many conditions that can lead to older people becoming disabled in their later years. My husband has recently been diagnosed with a neurological condition, motor neuron disease, sometimes described as the most feared illness and often used to try to justify euthanasia. How has he reacted? Not with fear, Perhaps we're too familiar with different bodily and cognitive impairments to be afraid. How have others reacted? Some with fear if they know the diagnosis, some with shock at yet another so-called tragedy. Someone even asked if a curse had been placed on our family. Some have a narrative of burden. Now I'm the saint. None are helpful reactions. You see, difference and disability is a normal part of life, a normal part of our lives. And that doesn't minimize the real challenges that individual disabled people face, or indeed those who are close to them. It only becomes disabling when we each, in our own way, reject people who are differently able to ourselves and have different needs, when we see participation as conditional, when we allow others to become hidden exiles for our own convenience, when we see people as inherently vulnerable, rather than understanding that our policies can place people in vulnerable situations where they then might be at risk of neglect, abuse, or exploitation. When a shorter life expectancy is considered inevitable. People with intellectual disability in the UK died 25 years earlier due to less access to tests and treatment. And in the Netherlands, where my research with Dutch colleagues found that intellectual and developmental disability is sometimes a reason for euthanasia. We can do something about this. Let's ensure the visibility of disabled people and amplify their voices. Let's welcome them and stop excluding them from connected and valued roles. The main barrier is our lack of empathy, our failure to see the person living in those particular shoes. The DDF declaration published yesterday says, dignity is not something granted to the person by others based on their gifts or qualities such that it could be withdrawn. It is prior to any recognition and it cannot be lost. All human beings possess this same intrinsic dignity, regardless of whether or not they can express it in a suitable manner. I will end by quoting a poem that my daughter Abigail dictated to us 10 days after her injury. She couldn't talk, and I taught her to communicate by closing her eyes and opening them at the letter of the alphabet. And she dictated this to my husband. Still silent body, but within my spirit sings, dancing in love light. Wouldn't it be wonderful if every disabled person was able to say that their spirit sings? Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila, for this persuasive and moving presentation. I think we learned that being personally touched by disability develops one's imagination and helps us develop also practical ways to build more inclusive societies at all levels. We will have time to talk and reflect on this presentation, and then the next speaker is Monsignor Roland Mineras. He will speak on disability and anthropological and theological challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister President, dear colleagues. Let me offer you some remarks about the anthropological and theological aspect of disability. We all have learned from interacting with persons affected with disabilities that they change our own perception of disability. Not that the phenomenon was unknown, but that it cannot be reduced to a one-way relationship. Persons with disabilities reveal to the healthy their own fragility. The young disability stays a word of spiritual strength and dignity. Our societies have changed their look on disabilities and are making efforts to overcome attitudes of marginalization or exclusion of persons with disabilities. The 2006 UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is a remarkable achievement in international law. National legislation very often gives guidelines protecting affected people in the fields of education, employment, access to public places, and transportation. Certainly, much has still to be done. Every year is celebrated the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. The point is that there is a promising ongoing change of mentality. This change of mentality is also clear in the teaching of the Church. No longer should we consider pastoral care for, but with disabled persons. We receive from them as much as we may give when interacting with them. When we speak of disabilities, we include those originated by physical, psychological, mental limitations. Sometimes we forget the spiritual dimension of the human being. Yet this spiritual dimension is addressed precisely because the physical or mental dimensions suffer limitations. Brain injuries may affect the mind and mental operations, but they do not annihilate the sphere of the spirit. The spirit is able to inspire resilience to a person with physical or mental illness. The spirit is a provider of sense and value. So the dialogue with persons with disabilities shifts often to the spiritual level, where the identity of the person dwells. Behind the limitations linked with our carnal condition appears the spirit. Spiritual strength is exactly the opposite of mechanical superiority. Ephesians 3:16 states that the Spirit strengthens the inner man. Our brothers and sisters who suffer disabilities and limitations in their body and even in their brain are not deprived of the enjoyment of their spirit. The strength of the spirit always operates within the limits of our human condition, often in a situation of weakness. Persons with disabilities may be able to manifest wonder in front of the beauty of creation and compassion with those in need and experience their selfless love. The apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium says, the worst form of discrimination is the lack of spiritual care. Pope Francis stressed, we are called to recognize in every person with disabilities, even complex and serious disabilities, a unique contribution to the common good through their original life story. The image of the strong, healthy, powerful, and generous actor offering support and help to the passive, disabled person in order to give her access to the world of full humanity has been replaced by the rediscovering of our common frailty. Handicap is a hollow image of health. It powerfully reminds the healthy ones of their own fragilities. The message of the gospel is directed to the weak, the ill, those possessed, or people who call for help. Jesus heals as a sign of the efficiency and proximity of God's reign. God wants his creatures healthy and happy. Jesus restores the wounded human condition. He offers to all fullness of life through a process of conversion. St. Paul, writing to the Corinthians, does not argue of his superiority as an apostle. He knows that sharing the gospel is not a one-way operation. It questions the transmitter as well as the receiver. Paul is fully aware of his own limits and fragility. Indeed, it is from his weakness that he exercises his mission as an apostle. He does not pretend to seduce his listeners through rhetoric or elusive promises so as to manifest the power of the gospel. We find often in Paul a contraposition of weakness and power, asthenia and dynamis. Asthenia is what characterizes the natural individual, the flesh. Paul puts his pride in his weakness. When I am weak, he says, then I am strong. He recognizes that he had thorn in his flesh, which could be a permanent physical disease. Elsewhere, Paul states that he holds the treasure entrusted to him in earthen vessels. These remarks of Paul may suggest more than a confession of his own weakness. They give insight into the limited condition of all human beings. The present condition of human life in flesh is weakness, opposed to the future condition of redeemed life in glory. In this our word, the Spirit comes to the aid of our weakness, quotation. In Christ, God has revealed himself, the voluntarily weak. Christ, who was in the form of God, emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, says Philippians. Paradoxically, the cross of Christ shows how the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Moreover, God shows the weak of the world to shame the strong. Promethean pretension to be all-powerful and to dispose of unlimited power and strength is a permanent temptation of humanity, but an illusion. The encyclical Laudato Si states, once the human being declares independence from reality and behaves with absolute dominion, the very foundations of our life begin to crumble. The challenge of disability opens us to the questions of our limits. Limits are not limitations. Limitation is imposed from outside and can be avoided. Limits are inherent to a being or a system and must be respected. Transhumanist thinking promises to explode biological and mental limits. The idea of enhanced man suggests a rebellion against our real human condition. It is not a humanist reaction of healing or repairing damaged health or brain conditions, but creating something else, a hybrid entity connected to the big data. We would lose what makes us human, our spirit, and our capacity to make free choices. Our inner personality would be absorbed in electronic synapses. Society puts limitations to our freedom, as we have to respect the freedom of others But our freedom meets its inherent limit in truth. Truth is the objective hindrance and the guide to an arbitrary use of our freedom of judgment. The ancient ecumenical councils, shared by Catholics and Orthodox, used to adopt a horos and canons, a definition and rules. The definition precisely puts the limit beyond which you are no longer in the truth. Recognizing the fundamental weakness inherent to our human common condition opens a new understanding of disability and interaction with the word of disability. Human disability indeed sheds light on anthropological as well as on theological aspects. By sharing our condition, our common wounded humanity, we may engage into communion, giving and receiving from each other in an exchange located on the level of the spirit. Our society relies on the increasing power of high-performing technology. This may be good, but still, says little about the condition of disability. Society has put forth that what is more desirable is a partnership with the disabled persons on a basis of human equality. St. Paul witnesses that preaching the gospel in his own weakness brings more fruit than talking from a learned to ignorant, from a mighty to a weak. Only God knows and is mighty, and he humbled himself to our condition. The apostle who teaches is himself permanently taught by the Lord. So should be our relationship with the word of disability. Persons with disability help us stay on the ground of our own weakness in a shared human fraternity. Thank you.
Thank you, Monsignor Mineras. We now have 10 minutes for questions and comments on the previous talks, and which in my view are very complementary. We have the doctrinal approach, and previously we had the practical conclusions of this approach. Yes, Matilde?
Thank you very much. My question is to Baroness Sheila Hollins. Thank you very much for the presentation, first of all. I just wanted to go back to your sentence in which you say having disability allows you to see things in a deeper manner, in a sense. I wonder whether we could share with this group that even not having disability allows you to have the eyes deep enough to go into the issue that the commonality is the human condition, thus we have to take care even without any disability.
Of course, that's an interesting turning it around, if you like. But the point is that often it is thought that, you know, that if you are a disabled person, then perhaps you would not have that capacity. I think it's, I ended by saying really that I think our lack of empathy for each other is what is so missing. And sometimes we only see what we see. We don't see the person within. And I could tell you many stories from my experience. And of course, in my experience as a mother is very different to the experience of my daughter, my daughters, my son. Their experience is different. My husband wrote a a little book about our experience of our daughter's injury. And our daughter kindly, commented on it and made some suggestions. And then she said, but Dad, this is your story. Okay. And the point is, we all have a story and we all have a depth of understanding, and we all, we want our spirits to sing, right? Whoever we are. And actually, if I am not a disabled person today, I may be a disabled person tomorrow. And it's just that the abilities and the impairments that we face and the barriers that we face during our lives, they are going to change during our lives. And we don't seem to understand as a human kind of group, really, that our actual condition and state of being and what we face in life is going to change, is going to vary. And we are living our life from birth until death, and disability may feature at some point, either for ourselves or for the people who are close to us. So but we often turn away from understanding that.
So thank you very much. I'm thinking about something I came across when I was preparing my talk, which when I was looking at social enterprises and their work with persons with disability on the employment issue. And one of the things I was trying to look for was faith-based social enterprises. And now maybe they don't put things on the internet, or maybe I couldn't find them, but I was thinking about that when you said this thing about religious orders running orphanages and I think we've got all the bases, the kind of thing that Monsignor was talking about, but we haven't kind of worked out all the implications on the practical level of what this means. And so a lot of the experience that people have within the church isn't at all aligned with these ideas. And I think that could be one of the kind of learnings that we need to sort of talk about in our final statement, something like this for the church. Anyway, thank you.
We had Jutta, Albino, Marta, and I don't see your name. Yeah. Jutta first, and then Albino.
Lord Baroness, for this wonderful and very touching, actually, talk, which also included strong recommendations for church and for politics. Do you think that you are heard? Do you think that our governance and the world moves towards a more open society vis-a-vis disabled persons, or the opposite, that we are more and more hiding them away?
I mean, there are a lot of international declarations and so on. I'm a legislator now, but actually I think sometimes that laws are unhelpful because people think the law is made now and therefore we can get on with our lives because we've done it, But actually, it's like we have a Down Syndrome Act, and was it a good thing to do or not? I'm not sure. The point is that will people's lives improve because of it? Not necessarily. And that's the trouble with legislation, that we can sometimes think we've ticked the box, but actually, unless attitudes change, and unless we become more open as a society, and I think in some ways social media, for example, has helped many disabled people to be able to engage more fully, for example, around work. But actually, it also diminishes the connections between people and between communities. And I think there are many, many more lonely people in our societies, and it may be that that's one of the contributors towards greater mental health problems. And this is true for many disabled people as well. So it's hard to say. I don't think things are necessarily getting better in one way, but there are things that can be done. And Sister Helen, I mean, your point about the orphanages, one of the ways of changing it is actually an economic way. So Hope and Homes for Children is working to close orphanages, and they're doing it by trying to cut off the money supply to orphanages, by trying to redirect charitable donations. You see, good Catholics think that they should give money to orphanages, right? But actually, that's a really bad place to send your money. Send your money instead to charities that are working to support families, to support disabled people, to support work for disabled people, to help disabled children to be in school, right? That would be a good intervention, right? So stop any money going from Rome to orphanages and retrain the sisters.
Albino, and then Marta, and Marcelo, and and here, yes.
Great, thank you. This is a question for Archbishop Minerath with respect to the theological challenge of disability. I can see and understand in terms of what you had mentioned about Paul. It is in my weakness that I am, strong. In terms of what would you pastorally suggest? How do you respond to a mother, for example, who is taking care of a disabled child and brings up the question of theodicy? If God is good, if God is all-knowing, if God is all-powerful, then why does God permit this? Especially since in reading the Gospels, what is so stunning about the Gospels is the enormous amount of healing that Jesus Christ does. And yet her prayers are unanswered. What compounds this even further is that disability is linked with poverty. So it's a whole cascading series of hardship. So in terms of the theological challenge, is there anything you would suggest in terms of pastorally? How do you respond to such questions?
It is certainly not easy to give a one single answer, because each situation would be different. A mother with a disabled child, you have the enormous love for the child, and this is all what you can expect from her. If she is a believer person, she would even think of Jesus Christ. Jesus is the one coming from, as the apostle says, the glory of the eternal God, and he humbled himself to our conditions in order to suffer with us and for us. And in this giving up of himself, you have the image of God for us, who is not far from our distress, but who has come into it and live it with us. And if this mother can look at her child with the eyes of Jesus, she would not say, as the common opinion it says, if God is all-powerful, what does he allow these things? But this is not the Christian answer. The Christian answer is, look, forget that God is all-powerful. He is all weak. He took the place of the weak in order to show that in this weakness and frailty and disability, he makes this explode into the life of the Spirit, which is a life to come. Obviously, I would not make such a discourse to that person. I would try to accompany her feeling and admire her love for her child. But this care and love you have all the Christian attitude. You have all the presence of God in our weakness. And this is why we celebrate the passage from death to life, to resurrection. And this is really the point of Christian faith.
Thank you. Well, we have plenty of questions right now. So I propose to move the questions forward to the next session in order not to lose, now it's the turn of Matilde Leonardi to make her presentation, and we will have a discussion afterwards.
Good morning, everybody, and I wish to thank very much the Pontifical Academy, Sur Ellen first, but also Fabio Ferrucci and all of you for listening. A brief sharing of my experience. I'm a doctor, I have no conflict of interest, and I am coming from Italy, from Milano, and I work as a neurologist, but I've been working on disability for the last 30 years. And I would like to start from what I would call the foundation. And let me go very, very, very far. I go to the Genesis. And there is this part of the Genesis in which you have Jacob. While he's going to cross the Jordan, he meets a man. And he starts to fight so much and so much. And then during this terrible fight that he will lose at the end, in a sense, he was able to understand that he was in fact winning. And he was winning what? He was winning an angel. And this angel, while he was going to collapse because he was beaten by Jacob, at the very end of this fighting, with a sword, cut his sciaticus nerve, the nerve sciaticus. And what is the message of this foundation? Jacob won the angel, but then he was stepping all his life. And this is called the anthropology of the despite. Despite he was blessed and he was stepping all his life because of this blessure at the sciaticus nerve, despite this, he was able to win an angel. Because this is what we are. We are stepping all our life, but we are human beings able to beat angels. And this is the message. This is the foundation. We are all stepping because we all have somebody that is giving us a sword in our ankle or in our sciaticus. But we are human beings able to beat angels. And this message from the foundation is in contrast with the progresses of biomedicine, I would say, that have been telling us all the past years that we are like a broken car. When you have a disease, you can repair it. And the past century was, in fact, all based on this biomedical concept that you can really repair everything. And that's, of course, the progresses of surgery, the progresses of antibiotics, as well as all the fights against diseases that we have been able to beat. However, we are in new scenarios. We are in a scenario in which biomedicine alone is not enough. We are meeting new diseases, and as neuroscientists, I can tell you that we are meeting diseases in which to say where is the disease is almost impossible to say. And it's also impossible to say what to cut or to add. If you have Alzheimer's, if you have any other neurodegenerative disease, what do you cut? So the biomedical model is not enough anymore, as well as it is not enough in the new epidemiological scenarios in which we are seeing that aging of population together with the increase of non-communicable diseases that are now 50% of the affecting diseases of the population, and that it depends also where you put the threshold. If I put the threshold that perfect view is my threshold, I will say that half of this room has a problem and a chronic disease in terms of your low vision that is altered. And also the age quake. I mean, as a doctor, I will say that's one of the best success of our science, that we are able to make people to age. We should be all jumping on our chairs because people age. Unfortunately, an aging of population is going everywhere. It's going, and this is, you see from this perspective from UN, that in 2050, the darkest part of the world will have a majority of 60 plus people in their inhabitants. We should be jumping for that. We've been able to move all the people to become old. However, we all know, and this is from UN, and you see the old dots represent men and women from different countries. There is a point in which your body ages, and you age, and your function in decline. Whatever is the age you're going to live, it says that the 15 years before the expected death, you're going to age, and your body is going to age, whatever is your life expectancy. So we are declining. That is something that we don't like. But at the end, if you look at all these scenarios, we're talking about different things, and it depends on which box you belong. You can speak about people with disability, people with chronic diseases, people with non-communicable disorders, old people, aging people, but we never really speak about the functioning of these categories that are, in a sense, put in different boxes according to where the money is, where the country is working, and everything. That's our foundation, but then we also have some motivation to work in the area of disability, which I think are very strong. Certainly, one of them is the UN Convention. I really do believe that it was a necessary pair of glasses. We didn't need another Convention of the Rights. Wasn't the Convention of the Rights of Human Beings of 1948 enough? Why do we need to do, are people with disability different from human beings for which the rights have been declared in 1948? Why do they need a separate convention? And the point is, the rights are the same, but the glasses through which these rights are restated in 2006 were allowing us to read these rights with different glasses. So the rights are the same of 1948. In general and in principle, we are not needing another convention, but it was essential to have this convention, to raise up people that were completely hidden in society. So countries are there requested to identify barriers. Well, I like this wording because it comes back again in my presentation. But then what it is, the UN Convention, it's a frame, it's a political frame. Who, between the politicians that you know, especially 2-3 months before election, will ever deny the right to work to any citizen? But people don't need the right to work, they need a job. And the difference from the right to work and the job, it's enormous. You don't ask the right to work, you want a job. And that's the difference of having ratified the convention. You know who is the first country who ratified the convention? It was China. I always like, because they had the fixed number of disabled. You know, I was working in WHO for many years, and China always had 2% of people with disability. And then they said, well, 2% is too low, and this happened 15 years ago. They said, well, 2% is too low. So they decided, okay, we put 3%. And then, of course, the global burden of disability in the world increased because there are billions. So, of course, the total number of disabled increased. But China was the first country who ratified the convention, which means that ratifying a convention doesn't mean that you apply what it is written inside. And I think this is also a political issue of almost 193 countries have been ratifying the convention. But if you go into the details of which country is operationalizing this convention, that is much different. And so we come into the disability issue, and that's the beautiful part for this academy. You are almost not doctors. So then why do you really need about the health conditions? What are you going to do? You didn't study as much as I did. I did study much more than many of you. And despite this, that health part is mine. But you have all the rest. Together, the people that work on disability have their own role. Doctors and those working in the health sector, they might deal with the health condition. And as I mentioned, the biomedical model for many of the health conditions doesn't work. But there's all the other part, the environment, in which everybody can have a role. The environment which constitutes the essential element to define disability. Environment that can be physical environment, social environment, attitudinal environment, political environment, what we would call the biopsychosocial determinant of health. You might not do anything on health, because you didn't even study as much as you should have to become a doctor. However, you certainly can do much more than a doctor, acting on the biopsychosocial determinants to decrease disability. That is also was rising up the pressing needs for a classification that is called ICF, International Classification of Functioning, Disability and Health. It is just a book, 1,400 codes. However, it brings inside what it is essential to describe functioning, which is this correlation and interaction of health condition and environment. If you imagine a McDonald's hamburger, you can see that the meat, which is inside, the body function and structures, the activity and participation, will never stay on if you only consider the health condition, which usually many countries in their own pension system, it is the only hooking element that you have to define disability, the diagnosis. But it is never enough. You need the other part of the hamburger. You need the environmental factor and the personal factor that are not classified in ICF. It was approved in 2001, and that was, and so far is still, the only cultural element that is been translated in 65 languages. It has been recognized as a theoretical instrument for discussing and maybe trying to see whether the UN Convention is finding something that is applicable or applied. Together with the ICD, the International Classification of Disease, which is only classifying diagnosis, it is part of the family of classification of ICF, of the WHO, and together with the ICHI, the International Classification of Health Intervention, they constitute the three classifications that try to give some borders. In the ICF, that is the classification that I'm interested in describing to you, disability is defined as a continuum. Who is disabled? Where does disability start? Where does normality ends if disability is the opposite of normality? Where's the line between these two? So the distribution of our population on the disability continuum will tell you that we only have a minority on the severe part of the curve, that is the severe disability. The rest of the world is on the other part of the curve that is very big, and it depends where you put the political threshold to define it, that you will define how many disabled you have in the country. So the whole debate about the definition of disability is not there, and we do not know how many disabled that we have. Of course you don't know, because, for example, 18 years ago, the UN made a survey asking two countries how many disabled that you have, and it happens that Norway was declaring that they have 35% of people with disability, and Syria was declaring that they have 0. Of course, if you're not counted, you don't count. But then Syria had the war and everything, and I challenge now Syria to report that they have 0 disabled people in their countries. And also, it depends what do you define and where do you define your threshold to define disability, because it is sometimes attached to money, so then you don't count people because you're afraid that you have to give them some reimbursement. So then you ignore them, and if they do not exist, you do not have to pay for them. Very easy and simple. But if it is disability, then is the outcome of the interaction between health condition and environmental factors. What means to this academy is the environmental factors, because that is where you can act at policy level to make changes in the disability level of global population. And that is challenging, but fantastic, because it gives you areas that you can work on to change. While you might not be changed the diagnosis of Down syndrome, but you can always change the context where a person with Down syndrome lives. And that is the strongest political hook I can describe to you and I can share with you. The need for ICF, of course, it's important. Why? Because when I tell you about rheumatoid arthritis, what do you see? You see the body structure, the joints of this lady that are deformated by the rheumatoid arthritis. That is the diagnosis that usually will allow her to have some benefits. And then what will you see? Well, you will describe the functioning, say, well, the structure, they're altered, and she cannot really do the activity of daily living, like closing the coat and closing the buttons. But we always forget in this picture that she is a grandmother, and she, despite, and I go back to the despite again, but with a different meaning, despite her disability, she still wants to keep her role as grandmother. And she still wants to use her deformed hands to help her daughter. and to help a grandchild. And so I think that the need for ICF is to change the perspective and to go into a different definition of disability intended as an umbrella term for, of course, limitation of activity, restriction of participation, and impairments in body function and structures. However, what counts is participation, which should be the outcome of any interaction, despite the physical or mental disability that you can have. So the functioning disability are multidimensional, yes, they encompass the human experience at the different levels, body function and structures, activity and participation, but always in the interaction with the environment. And I think that the role of this grandmother is what counts for her. What is counting for you? What is important for you? I think the biopsychosocial model allows a description of the global picture, an holistic approach to the person, not puzzles, not the eyes, that is the one for which you will get reimbursement, not the ear, not the mouth. You get reimbursement for a part of you, but you are you, and you are in where you live, what are your desires, what are your needs. So then there are no special needs. I don't believe in special needs. I think the needs are the same for everybody. But the accommodation to answer to these needs is different. Everybody wants to be loved, and everybody wants to eat, everybody wants to go out, everybody wants to have significant relationship, but everybody can get these things that are the usual needs with special answers. So for me, there are no special needs. There are only special answers to common needs. And I think that I go then into the third point, that is collaboration. I have only 4, so I'm always at the end. And the collaboration goes in reading everything that the world is trying to do nowadays. We are in a political era, and I think I can say BC and AC, that in the Catholic Church means something, but for me as a doctor, I would say before COVID and after COVID. And I'm saying this because the COVID has signed a difference in societal attitudes in many, many areas. But it is not changing what is going on at the international global level. We have the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals. I work on SDG number 3 mostly because it's where I'm trying to move things ahead. And we have only now 7 years to go. And there are many things in there. There is a non-communicable global strategy that is working at UN, and there's the baseline report on decade of healthy aging. We have the action plan. As a neurologist, we have the WHO Global Action Plan on epilepsy and other neurological disorders, but also we have the mandate on rehabilitation 2030 that is provide disability, all people with disability, the proper rehabilitation worldwide. And 2 days ago, we had Dignitas Infinita. Everyone has their inalienable dignity. I will pronounce it in English. So then, I think that we are lucky. I mean, 2 days ago, this came out, that is paving our way, is giving the theory the church wants that. How do you, member, as academicians, with the responsibility and the role of making this operationalized worldwide? How do we work as academicians? I'm a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life. We have a lesser, I will complain with my president. I like your most, I would say. I like this. But that's beyond my conference. I'm saying that how can we, as academicians, have a role in making that theory and that frame of the Dignitas Infinita true? People don't have the right to have dignity. People need to become dignified persons. And the difference of having the frame and making this frame operationalized, this is what the Academy of Social Science has to do. How do you transform the frame of Dignitas Infinita into the reality in country level of what is the dignity? And I think that ICF classification as such is an instrument which has done and has put a hierarchical list of categories. And why do we need it? Because we need a common language. When I say disability, I cannot hear anymore the word handicap, not because of cosmetic reasons, but also in my country. We have the law for handicap because we are unable to change it. But I think that we are trying, and it's not only cosmetic, because it's not person with disability what counts with disability, is person, the point that we are trying to put in common. We are all persons, so that is the commonality. How can we change this? It's a work. It's a conceptual model, the ICF. It's telling that function is not only about what a person cannot do. You mentioned, Baroness, is what person can do. But who cares what person can do if the person can do this in the loneliness of his room? If nobody's looking what you can do, I don't care what you can do. I keep you close in a room. And I think that then it is important to define a profile of disability and function, not only because we are treating the problem, but because we are addressing people's needs in relation to their lived experience in their own context. So it's the best indicator of treatment needs and service outcomes. You will hear later from my colleague and friend, Professor Jérôme, speaking about human functioning revolution. He has been writing about it. And it is about speaking about functioning despite the impairment. So the WHO concept of human functioning, it is a way to rethink health. It's a new understanding of health with a wide range of consequences. Functioning is not just the outcome of health. It's capturing the lived experience of health, which is intrinsically in health, but is not so well clarified. It's like denying responsibility of society, while the lived experience of health is accounting for the value of health, both for the individual and society as large. So in a sense, the concept of functioning is integrating biological health, which is where I work as a doctor, but the lived health, the person's actual performance in interaction with the environment. So it is key to value health in relation to the individual and to the environment. We will never reach the SDG number 3 if we do not work thinking that what we are doing in terms of political engagement is to work for the il bene comune, the common good, which is the public good. What is the common good? I think we have Nobel Prizes here. You can say that economically is something that is very clear to you. I challenge you, economists. You are guiding us, but I think that you should look at us a bit more, because people with disability face barriers in all areas of life: education, employment, social and political life, community participation, and health, which is bringing us that these barriers are bringing, and they are evident, and they have nothing to do with the disease itself. Inadequate policies and standards, negative attitudes, lack of provision of services, problem with service delivery, inadequate funding, lack of accessibility, lack of consultation and involvement, lack of data and evidence. Where is my role as doctor here? Is not here. Where is the role of health here? Is not here. Is the whole role of all the political people, whatever is their role, to change these disabling barriers and make them facilitate. Because barriers have negative consequences. There is lower educational achievement, lower level of employment, higher rate of poverty, poorer health outcomes. I was member of the Italian government group writing the UN Convention. And there is a point in the UN Convention in which you will read at page 3 that when we speak about people with disability, we also include women and children. I remember that debate. Women and children were not considered persons. And there has been a point in which the debate was February 2005. And there was this big call in which there was an opposition to include women and children in the concept of person. Because if you're a person, in many countries you have rights. If you are ignored as a person, you do not have rights. So if you are a girl with disability in a country in which you're not counted, and you're not a person, then there's no problem if you do not have any health insurance or you don't go to school because you're not a person. So you will find in the convention at page 3, that when we say person, we include also women and children. We did have to specify. It was led by Sweden, by the way, that debate, and all the Northern European countries went on, and they were saying we are not going to sign the convention if you do not put that person are also women and children. And I would say that this brings us to the culture of discharge. Carto in Italian. I like the Italian word more than English. Discharge doesn't fits to me, but it is what the Pope always says, the contemporary impatient, because we are impatient. We only want men, 40-year-old, beautiful, healthy, working, productive. Well, they rest in that manner, 30 seconds, they also age immediately after. So I would say that contemporary today is the culture of discharge, of those that are not perfect, healthy, productive. And it reminds us many, many things. But then we go to my last point, which is commitment. And commitment follows all the others, because it is what are we engaged in. Well, and then I want to speak about what I'm working on. I was consultant of the Ukrainian government in 2021. And I was dealing with the reform of disability assessment because they introduced ICF in Ukraine to change the perspective. And I was consulting in Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Russian to make a change of the old system to consider disabled people in those countries. So I was aware of how it works, the disability system in those countries. And I was monitoring with ICF the application of the UN Convention, because all these countries ratified the UN Convention. So I underline that I think it was an issue of friendship. I underlined it was important to start resistance from what we do. We are men and women of science, culture, and of art. And I think that whatever bridge will have to be built will pass through that. And as a woman of science, I think that bridges, whenever will be the time, we'll have to start somewhere. And we are lucky because we belong to those cultures, these 5% of the world. We're so lucky and spoiled that we can be those that keep the possibility of these bridges open. But my famous #1 rule is look for the crazy ones who fuel human resistance. There are crazy people who do everything to destroy the world, but there are also crazy people that do everything to save it. And I am so lucky. I know many of these second crazy people. I find easier to align myself with the latter. Even when everything around seems hopeless and despair must always be fought everyone as best as you can. I personally have been fighting it for 30 years of work, staying close to family and friends. And therefore, as I'm staying close to Igor Boyko and Sister Justina. They're my friends. Sister Justina Holuber, she's a geneticist, a psychologist. She founded the first hospice for neonatal and newborns in Ukraine, and she does palliative neonatal care, and she is the first neonatologist doing this. And Father Igor, she is the son of the Church of Silence and of those persecuted under the Soviet Union. And he was tasked by John Paul II to found the seminar, of which he is now rector in Lviv, in Ukraine. They are both members of the Pontifical Academy for Life, and they are my friends. That's where we met. When the war started, I decided you don't leave the friends alone, and I started to go to Ukraine. And I started to look and to work with them because I was already working with the government, and so I was interested in what's happening to disabled people during the war. And of course, on Lancet, there was this immediate paper that says that there are public health consequences of war, and it came out 3 weeks after the beginning of the war on Lancet. But also, I was following the appeal from Ukrainian disabled people, like in all wars, people with disability are those that suffer most. I am a member of the task force about war in Ukraine of the WHO, and we've been working on the situation of refugees with disability outside. But I had a question. I was aware before the war, we had all these internats, these institutions with more than 260,000 people in there. And I was seeing at the beginning of the war that all these people with disability were going out. People with deafness were going to the Netherlands, to Italy, mostly blind people were going to Spain. I was wondering, were they liberated from the institutions that I was trying to close together with UNICEF and the European Disability Forum, or it was emptying this institution for Ukraine? So I did these questions also to Ukrainian colleagues because it was an issue. Will they ever be back to go to Donbass? And then, of course, the issue of the 15,000 kidnapped from the east part of Ukraine came out, and now is Cardinal Zuppi following them, out of which 4,000 are kids, and I'm also following that. But the internet, what is this? The so-called Soviet Model Institute that I've been seeing in all the countries where I've been in the post-Soviet Union, and it is called transit orphanage, meaning that, as you said, in fact, not all the orphans in these places are orphans, but what it was said by the system is that you are not able to take care of your disabled child, you are poor, it's better if you put them in an institution. So majority of the kids with disability or with something, either they come from very fragile family, prostitutions or alcohol abuse or other things, or they're real orphans. Before the war, we had 260,000 in the internats, and now we've lost control of what's happening in the east part of the country because many have been closed and many of these orphans have moved to the west part of the country. And the situation in many of these is very bad. But I'm following with the European Disability Forum the experience in Bulgaria. In Bulgaria, they've been taking all the families who've been putting their children here, and with an education program, they've been able to bring back from orphanage to families, original families, 48% of the kids who were in some internats. So now we are following some experiments in Ukraine to educate the family, to bring children back to their families just by educating the family and supporting the family. Of course, this opens many things. But there's also another group of disabled that came out, which was not there before, which is the veterans. Of course, they do not consider themselves disabled. They call themselves heroes. And they do not consider to be the same as the disabled of the internet. However, from the international perspective that I have, they belong, for the concept of biopsychosocial model, to an area that needs facilitation. Just as a matter of fact, 2 days ago, the Times published that also in Russia, we have more than 500,000 new disabled that are the veterans of war. So we don't speak about this, that is going to be the heritage of war for ages, right? But so then I decided, okay, let's work with the crazy ones. And that's why I'm doing with the Catholic University of Ukraine and Italy a course on disability management in Ukraine, in Lviv. And what we do in this, I want to train the first generation of disability managers in Ukraine, and we have been developing 4 case studies. We are going to create the first generation of disability manager in Ukraine, and we started the course last month. I'm sharing it for you, and I'm closing my conference now. I'm sorry for taking your time, but we really think that using the convention and using the ICF, it is the way in which we can speak at disability, also in a place where you had the internet, also where disability was to be hidden, also where disabled people were hidden from population. So the worst ever thing that can happen to a country, which is a war, could be the opportunity to do something different, good. Taking out children from the orphanage, speaking about disability in a different manner, changing the culture of inclusion, moving towards a complete non-accessible country, towards a country that is different from as it was before. So the conference started. She's Tatiana Lomakina. She's the counselor of Zelensky for disability and accessibility issues, and his father, Igor, and she is the coordinator of the course, Yarina. The disability manager is responsible for the entire process of inclusion and integration and main issues related to the new scenarios that Ukraine has. You never had disabled people walking in Lviv until the beginning of the war because they were hidden in orphanage. And last year, when the first disabled person was walking in Lviv, we realized that nothing was accessible. No shops had an entrance. There was nothing in terms of transportation that could allow them to move. All the streets of the villages of Ukraine, they are completely inaccessible. And so we decided, okay, we need to do something. We start from a class, culture. I think culture is what I'm able to do. I'm not a politician like many of you, but I can teach. So let's start with what you can do. And that's the first class of disability managers in Ukraine last week. And we have 4 cases, and they will work with this. We'll present it to the government. Case 1 is disability management of children with disability, pathways towards participation and inclusion. It's already challenging this. The second group is working on employment and disability, the Pizzeria Vittoria because I'm opening a pizzeria in Lviv, an inclusive pizzeria. So we work on the case model of opening inclusive pizzeria in the country. And to speak about inclusive employment, why do you need people to work with the others? And disability management in the transition from internat to home, we have chosen one internat and we tried the pathway to close it towards bringing the children back home or making a family home in which we will take the children that have no family anymore. And we work with the Superhuman and Unbroken, which are the largest rehabilitation center for veterans, to see what happens after you finish rehabilitation. How do you send back these men and boys? They are 25 to 35, more or less. They are married, they have kids. The age of their kids is usually 2-3 years, so they're all young people. What does it mean, inclusion, participation, going back to work? So we use ICF, and its definition, any person in any moment of life can have a health condition that in a negative environment becomes disability. So the crazy people who work on human resistance turn tragedy into an opportunity, fragility into a cure, desperation into hope. These crazy people meet in the name of friendship, culture, knowledge, esteem, love, and for those who believe, faith. And I think, really, to say that when everything is dark, even one candle makes light. So any of you can be a candle. And I think this is the message that the church should give. We can all be candles, and so many people can be candles to us. It was said already, globalization made us global, but didn't make us brothers. I think in making us brothers, that's the hope, that everybody's a candle for the others. And that's, I think, the message that should come out from this Pontifical Academy, because be crazy is the time for the human functioning revolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matilde, for your enthusiastic and passionate presentation, which we all enjoyed. I learned very much from it. Now I have a problem. We all have a problem. We need to go to the coffee, and then afterwards, perhaps we can have our discussion. I'm sorry, but okay. We are back. In principle, we are supposed to connect with Jerome Bickenbach, but this should be online in Zoom, on Zoom. It's okay? So the next speaker will be Professor Jerome Bickenbach, who works at the Faculty of Health Sciences and Medicine at the University of Lucerne, and is professor in the Department of Philosophy and faculties of Law and Medicine at Queen's University in Canada. So, Jerome, when you want, the floor is yours.
Am I being heard loudly enough? Is the volume high enough?
Sorry?
The volume of the microphone.
Yes,
my microphone.
yes.
Oh, I'm okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I will start. It's a great privilege to be not there, unfortunately, but to be participating in this esteemed event, and I'm humbled by this, and I wish I could be there in person. I want to directly address the theme of the first session, which involves the operationalization of rights for persons with disabilities. So I'm going to be taking a perspective which is very close to my dear friend Matilda Leonardi, who paved the ground for what I'm about ready to say. But I'm going to try to give it I don't know, more practical, if you like, focus from the perspective of a lawyer, as I am, and a social policy analyst. So I'm going to indulge the academician in the room with respect to certain kinds of very basic distinctions in social policy analysis, and then show you how these play out in an interesting and sometimes provocative and conflictual way in the context of disability. So the distinction I want to draw is familiar to many of you, and it's between when you engage in operationalization of rights or social aspirations, you can either pass legislation and regulations that are universalistic in focus, which provide a benefit, a support to everyone equally without qualification, or you can target individuals by virtue of their specific needs and then focus on satisfying those specific needs. So the distinction is between universal policy and targeted policy. Now, each of these has their advantages and disadvantages. A universal policy has the advantage of being easy to administrate, doesn't cost a lot of money because you're not doing the effort of finding specific people, but it often has the downside of appearing to be overly generous or under generous, depending on the actual need of the person you're focusing on. If someone does not actually require a benefit, they get it anyway. And that because the policy is universal and applies to everyone. In a targeted policy makes more sense because you're actually focusing on the actual need of an individual. But in order to operate in a targeted way, you have to spend resources on eligibility to determine who has the need and who doesn't have the need. And sometimes those costs take up 40% of the overall budget, just to ensure if you're focusing on a particular group that has a specific need, then you have to identify those with that need and distinguish those from who don't have that need. So both approaches have their advantages and disadvantages. And I bring this up because in the area of disability, this is particularly involves attention which takes various forms, and I'll give you a couple of examples. But one of the forms it takes is how we interpret this wonderful document, the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Because I'm sure all of you in the room will immediately say, should we look at the CRPD as a universal document or as a targeted document? And that's precisely the distinction I want to draw out and show some of its tensions and some of its potential downfalls, all of which go to the very practical question is of how a country can create a legal system of laws and regulations that optimize the operationalization of these human rights. What's the best way forward? What's the most effective way of doing that? And what I mean, why does this targeted universal apply to disability? Well, one reason from the universal perspective is something which Matilda has already mentioned, but let me emphasize it because it has deep philosophical significance. The universal perspective on disability is one to which I am extremely fond because it emphasizes the fact that disability is not some special feature of humanity. It is part of what humanity means. It is part of the human condition. It is not some aberration of humanity. It is fundamental to what people are. People are vulnerable, people break down, people die, people suffer, people are in pain. And this is not a feature of humanity which some people have and other people don't. It's just fundamental to what it means to be a human being. Now that thought, that underlying conception is what makes many of us say, well, what we're looking at when we operationalize human rights is emphasizing the universality of it. We are all in it together. We are all human beings. Disability is part of the la condition humaine. It's part of what it means to be to be a human being. On the other hand, and because of insights from the disability advocacy community and researchers for the past 50 years, we understand that actually the experience of disability is socially constructed in the sense that it depends very, very much, not so much on the underlying impairment or health condition, but it really depends on the reaction of other people, the physical environment, the structure. All of these environmental factors mean that two people with identical underlying impairments can have extremely different experiences. So that suggests targeting makes more sense because what you're targeting is the actual lived experience of individuals and the actual needs they have, which will differ in a way which is not universalistic, but particularistic. It will depend on the actual circumstances of people. So here we have a fundamental frisson between two understandings of what it means to have a disability. One, universalistic, participating in the human condition, comme les autres, participating as a person that everyone has these vulnerabilities, these needs, these aspirations as well. On the other hand is, well, different people have different needs, and in order to achieve a sense of equality as a result, you're going to have to differentiate in how you target benefits. So what I want to draw out to you is this is not a accidental or incidental conflict. This is fundamental to what we mean by disability. I say that because some years ago, some colleagues of mine wrote a piece in which we tried from a different angle to elucidate some of the underlying features of this conflict, this tension, and to see how it affects how we construct social policy and how we write our laws. And what we suggested, and it's just a heuristic verbal distinction, but what we suggested is there's actually two kinds of disabilities that we understand. There is the sociological understanding of persons with disabilities. Understanding persons with disabilities is actually a completely bound notion that has historical, sociological, psychological features to it, which represents the lived experience of people with disabilities. And also, as my colleague Tom Shakespeare, who's in the room, I see, it creates potentially an identity of what it means to be a person with disabilities. Is the disability experience is part of that identity. So let's call that persons with disabilities, but there's another, and obviously that is the sense that is more congenial to the targeted approach. The other sense of disability is people experiencing disability. And that, because it focuses on the fact that there's an underlying humanity and it's experience that is fundamental to what it means to be a human being, obviously reflecting the universal perspective. Now, both of these, persons with disabilities, person experiencing disability, have historical roots and professional affiliations, if you like, and have been dealt with through the literature in various ways. Let me just spend 1 minute or two reviewing this. The social identity sense of persons with disabilities is actually responsible for what used to be called the minority group analysis, and especially in the United States was fundamental to understanding what now we call the human rights approach to disability. And since it arose in the context of that cultural milieu, the United States, it focused on a minority group of people who are insular and discrete, as the phrase was, the legal phrase, so that they had a historic disadvantage through discrimination, benign ignorance, misrepresentation, stereotyping, and other socially constructed phenomena, which created them as a minority group. And as a minority group, they had a call on the resources of the state to repair, to compensate for the discrimination. And this led through a series of steps in the 80s, 90s, with respect to UN actions and civil rights actions and other features, ending ultimately in the production and the release of the CRPD. So the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities historically grew out of the persons with disabilities understanding. So on that phrase, to jump ahead on that understanding, we would say operationalizing CRPD means targeting legislation to a group of people. That's what it seems to mean historically. Now, the other understanding of disability, namely as a universal human experience, doesn't have so much of a sociological explanation as, if you like, a factual basis. Namely, everyone is embodied. And a very, very important phrase, which I just stole from Tom as well, from his paper, and I think it's exactly right. Human beings are embodied, and the embodiment comes with it inevitably, and in fact, universally, comes with embodied vulnerabilities, embodied decrements of functioning, embodied issues. And which is to say that part of the price of, if you like, of being embodied is that you bloody well should expect pain, discomfort, lack of functioning. That's what it means, once again, to be an embodied human being. So the basis for the universal approach is that factual one. Now, because we are complicated creatures, the two perspectives that I'm outlining here ended up being represented in a conflict manner between what I think we can say is ancient history language of the medical model and the social model of disability, whereas the universal approach is more or less aligned with the so-called medical approach to disability. Now, I think that's unfair and for various reasons, but I won't go into it. But I do want to highlight one feature of the universal approach in the social policy context that has been underrated, I think. And it's represented by an American sociologist by the name of Irvin Zola. And Irvin, in the 80s and 90s, Irvin Zola was a disability advocate, the head of the American Sociological Association for some years, and also the head of the Americans with Disabilities organization in the United States, and a very active advocate for the rights of people with disabilities, but and a person with disabilities himself. And his view toward the end of his life is summed up by one of his last articles, which is titled "Toward the Necessary Universalizing of a Disability Policy." And his argument, sociologically and historically, is very powerful. What he said is, obviously, to raise an issue, to advocate, to focus attention, to spotlight a particular problem, you emphasize the difference between one group of people and another, whether that's based on racial grounds, on gender grounds, on religious grounds, or disability. You need to highlight the difference, and that means you focus on not what we have in common, but what makes us different. And you do that for good political strategic reasons. And we do it as long as we need to do it. Now, he argued, however, that ultimately, and not idealistically, but he thought fairly soon, all of that had to be dropped away in favor of focusing on human need in its variation. And that is to say, universal policies that are adjusted to the difference between people. So a universal approach to education, which we have, a universal approach to employment, which we don't have, and other areas, a universal approach to access to resources and a living wage and nearly any other social policy you want to think of, should have an universal focus, but have a ability to address within that context differences in need. And this is extremely important when you understand disability from the point of view, as my colleague Matilda reminded us, that in the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health, the ICF approach based on functioning, one of the salient features of disability is that it is in the world a matter of more or less, not yes or no. People have levels of impairment. All of us have, well, especially in this room, as I look at the age bracket I'm looking at, all of us have inevitably some impairments, visual or mobility or whatever, and some of these are chronic, or some of them, as in my case, I just had a total knee operation. So this is something which I will, will progress out of, and my impairment in mobility, which is now extremely low, will hopefully increase. So all of us live in a level of spectrum across a continuum. And if you understand the underlying impairment as a continuum between mild impairment to major impairment, you can see that the needs that are generated are also on that continuum. But at the same time, because of the insights of the disability rights community, we also know that the social context, the reception, the environment may make a difference. So we have to take both of these things into account. So how does that come across? So how does that apply to CRPD? And I'm tidying up the strains of my argument here. Well, not so much these days, but for a while in the early days of the CRPD in the 2008 to 10 era, there was a controversy about whether the CRPD was a universal human rights document that applies to people with disabilities, or actually a document that created new human rights that were only or special with respect to people with disabilities. Now, in that contrast I just gave you, you see the difference between a universal understanding of human rights and one which says there's a group of people who have a supra level or an additional level of human rights. Now, luckily, that debate has sort of fizzled out because as my good friend Jared Quinn put it, the point here is not that people with disabilities have superhuman human rights, but just that for historical reasons, it has been essential to reaffirm the same rights that people that we all have for people with disabilities, and the CRPD at the bottom, conceptually, philosophically, remains a universal document because indeed it's a document of human rights. Matilda mentioned, why do we need CRPD when we could have just used the Universal Declaration of Rights? Well, the answer to that question is not because people with disabilities have additional rights that others don't, but rather because we have to reaffirm, we have to stand up for and make clear that people with disabilities have the same rights. So there you have it. You have the contrast that I began with. On the one hand, CRPD must be responsive to the actual lived experience of people with disabilities in employment or whatever area we want to operationalize our law, because people are different and differently situated. At the same time, we want a universal human document. Human rights are rights, the only qualification for which is being human. That's the only eligibility requirement, that you be human. Because of that, it is fundamentally a universal document that requires a targeted application and operationalization. So that gives us in this business the challenge, which has been taken up in other areas, looking at progressive universalism, incremental universalism, and many other phrases, or targeted universalism, in a way to cleverly capture both sides of this very fundamentally human coin. Namely, we are both the same as everyone else in dignity, respect, and fundamental human rights. That level of universality is absolutely fundamental to the framework of how we understand ourselves in a civilized society. universality and that form of equality is absolutely fundamental. But we are clever people that realize that as we live out our lives have a particularity to them that creates particular kinds and degrees and extents of needs, and that in order to respect fully human beings, you have to take into account those differences. Now, to sum up, my challenge as a lawyer in social policy is crafting the language of laws that does those two things simultaneously. And that would be the challenge of operationalizing the CRPD, which is what I was asked to talk about. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jerome. We now have 10 minutes to ask questions to Jerome, comment on his presentation before we move to the next presentation by Marta. Yes? Professor Stiglitz?
Yeah, let me say, I thought that was a wonderful presentation, and I think I just want to highlight and emphasize some of the things that you mentioned. I think the approach of universality that you came to support at the end is important when we think about the broad issues of inclusion that are central to thinking about the issues of disability. And I think the fact that there's a continuum of something that was emphasized earlier, that it's multidimensional. And when you think about multidimensionality, then it becomes even more clear that we all have our disabilities, we all have, and that the bright lines that we use are both for political reasons and are socially constructed. And we have to recognize that social construction as part of the appropriate response. As an economist, we debate this issue of targeting versus universality all the time. Yeah. And with limited resources, we always wind up with a view that targeting is necessary simply because we have limited resources. You mentioned at the beginning the amount of resources that we spend on targeting. I think that one way of thinking about that is that we worry too much about errors of inclusion of those of those getting benefits that shouldn't, rather than the other side, which is those who ought to get benefits who don't. And if we took that view of type 1 and type 2 errors and thought about that, I think we could run a system without the high administrative costs that we do. I think there's too much worry about giving money to people who don't deserve it. That error is not as important as the other error.
Thank you. If I may respond, thank you very much. One of the examples of that is I work in many countries trying to reform their disability assessment, disability determination programs, which invariably are or should be a triaging activity where you say this person should go away with it. I mean, they don't have a problem. This group of people obviously have a problem, and in the middle there are people, depending on their budgetary limitations and whatnot, we can provide them with pensions or support of some other sort. And which is fair enough, although sometimes that obstacle seems to be even making that decision seems to be a waste of time, motivated, as you say, by by trying to avoid the I think it's type 1, the inclusion, too many people getting benefits. And in some countries, since those benefits are 100 euros a month, one wonders what the big deal is and why spend so much money in administrative costs to try to avoid that kind of what a bartender would call spillage, namely the kinds of minimal kinds of over support. And the recommendation has always been, especially in the case of children, just look at need directly. I mean, don't worry about qualification of an individual to be disabled or any of those things. Typically done medically, I might add, and just work in terms of the actual documented need that people have. The trick is, and what makes life interesting, is the continuum, because from a public health point of view, I mean, I like many in the room, I work in the public health space, and looking forward with respect to population aging on the one hand, and the higher prevalence of non-communicable diseases. If you want to put the future in a short sentence, it's going to be a future of people living longer in worse health. And because of the underlying worse health, you're going to have an increase in impairments and therefore an increase in disability prevalence as well. So that's the future. Thank heavens we're living longer, but it's living longer in a state of increasing disability. So if you look at that overall picture, the focus of social policy should actually be on those people who with mild and moderate conditions at the moment, because what you can do is then ameliorate and keep that slant, the slope of the line, the trajectory away from the high end, high need, and very expensive side. So we're more interested actually from a social policy point of view for people with mild and moderate impairments, just as a matter of policy. But that opens up complexities in the policy design that are very difficult to overcome. Thank you for your comment.
We have time for another question by Justin, please.
Thank you for that. Yes, I think what your speech has very well highlighted is that we've had one part of the difficulty, I think, is that we've had this view of disability as misfortune. Somebody else used the term theodicy beforehand, which is basically, why does a good God allow bad things? But the question here is actually that disability is not about theodicy. It's much more about, it's an instantiation of the limits that all of us as humans have. And disability is one possible exemplification of those limits. But if we all see ourselves as all human and all limited, rather than pretending that occasionally we could be God on our own if we tried hard enough, we perhaps get a healthier view of disability.
I agree 100%. The only underlying tension there is a form of realpolitik, in the sense that in order to have resources shifting in a society, you have to have a cause. You have to have a distinctiveness that gives you a complaint, so to speak. And I have been accused many times of just being naive with respect to the message that disability is part of the human condition. We are all, I mean, all of us are or will become, living with impairments that may lead to disabilities, and that's all fine and good. But there are people who need things now, and in order to get the things that they need now, they have to emphasize that yes, they're human, but they are humans with specific and identifiable and measurable needs.
Well, now we have to introduce Marta Cartavia, who's going to speak on disabilities, rights, and relations. Thank you, Marta.
Ana Marta. I am a lawyer, and therefore I will speak from a legal perspective. But before starting my presentation, I would like to introduce a preliminary remark about what the law can do, about disability, or in general about human values. The law, in my view, cannot do all the job. We tend in general to overstate the role of legislation. I don't want to underestimate that good legal structure can help, or at least can be not so much detrimental. So we still have to reason about what is the most beneficial contribution and the legal framework that can help and can help our social life and our common good, but do not rely too much on legislation. Having said that, and I was very much sympathetic with Baroness Hollins when she says now that I'm a lawmaker, I understand that law is not that helpful or maybe also unhelpful for the situation of people with disability. Having said that, let's start from a point that everybody considers as a turning point in the history of the legislation about disability, which is the UN Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It was really a big change in our social understanding of disability because it put human dignity in the center, speaks about fundamental rights, helped and pushed social institution in advancing inclusivity, removing discrimination, prejudice, and stigma. And there is a big change that we are witnessing, especially in Europe in this context, that is described in the paper. The paper, I apologize, is much too long. I will summarize some essential points on which I would like to draw your attention. Why the Convention of the United Nations is so important, I think that has already been said by the previous speakers, in particular by Matilde Leonardi, where she highlighted that the idea behind the convention, and I quote the first article, is that persons with disability include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So in the big contribution of the convention is that it stresses the idea that disability is not a physical, mental, or sensorial impairment as such. An impairment, weakness, dysfunction become an issue of disability in the interaction with the surrounding context, environment, where barriers and obstacles become an impediment to social participation. That's why lawyers have something to do, because we can work not on the side of the impairments, but at least on the side of the social barriers. I would like to focus my presentation on one instrument that has been at the center of, one legal instrument that has been at the center of the UN Convention, and is developing and this is being disseminating a little bit all over the world. And this idea is the idea of the reasonable accommodation as a cornerstone in legislation pertaining to individuals with disabilities. This instrument has proved to be one of the most effective, as well as one of the most flexible and suitable to improve inclusion and full participation of persons with disability in social life. In fact, the Convention, according to that definition of disability, requires much more than refraining from open and direct discrimination, nor are sufficient in the ideas of the Convention the traditional economic benefits and social services or medical treatments which are relevant but not enough provided by the legislation on this matter. The effort required by the Convention is to remove as much as possible the factual barriers that in the standard, let's say, daily life, in fact, hinder the participation of disabled people in social life. What is reasonable accommodation? This instrument, to my knowledge, took origin in Canadian anti-discrimination law. It requires all kinds of subjects, employers, landlords, public and private service providers, to accommodate the need of individuals in order to ensure that they can enjoy equal opportunity in social life. This could mean, for example, permitting an employee not to work on a religious holiday or create an appropriate workplace for a person with physical disability. In Canada, reasonable accommodation applies to all forms of discriminations based on sex, gender, ethnic origin, color, age, religion, and indeed disability. It is widely applied in labor law, but it has a larger scope of application. Eventually, in the 90s, reasonable accommodation became very influential in the American law with the American with Disability Act of the 1990. And not surprising then, at the time of the negotiations of the UN Convention, reasonable accommodation was at the center of the legal framework, and it is defined at Article 2. Reasonable accommodation means necessary and appropriate modification and adjustment of the environment, not imposing a disproportionate or undue burden where needed in a particular case to ensure to persons with disability the enjoyment or exercise on an equal basis with others of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. All human universal rights, but in an individual feature, in an individual kind of application. Similar definition is provided by the EU Directive of 2000. I'm not going to repeat and to reread the definition. There are some 5 features of this instrument, these legal instruments that in my view are valuable or at least are interesting to debate. First, the duty to accommodate is an obligation for public as well as for private actors. Reasonable accommodation is widely applied in labor law, so that the duty to accommodate falls first of all on employers. Yet the same duty bounds local and national institutions, schools, other educational facilities, sport facilities, movie theaters, commercial activities, music institutions, prisons, and other infrastructure. I provide a number of cases and examples. I do not have those beautiful stories to tell you in order to explain how things work, but at least in case law we can find concrete example of life. For example, I just mentioned a case from the European Court of Human Rights of 2016, where a student was refused by the Turkish National Music Academy because she was blind. The applicant was completely qualified for admission to the academy, and the refusal had been based only and solely on her disability. The court said that the failure to accommodate, to provide reasonable accommodation to facilitate the access for such a student was a form of discrimination. So, you know, just an example to see how universal can be and how demanding from all kinds of social actors is this instrument. In prisons is very important. We have a number of people with mental or physical disabilities in prisons, and this is a huge problem of our detention centers, but I don't want to insist too much on this. The second feature that I've already mentioned illustrating the previous case is that the unjustified refusal to provide reasonable accommodation is considered a form of discrimination. You know, not just direct discrimination, but somebody who does not at least try to provide this reasonable accommodation is discriminating against the person with disability. And the UN Convention expressly provide in this sense in Article 2 and 5, the jurisprudence of the European courts, both in the Council of Europe and the European Union, consistently applies this principle. Third, this is one of the features that I consider the most relevant. One of the distinctive features of reasonable accommodation is that it triggers a process. It opens a process of dialogue between the parties involved, rather than simply prescribing an outcome predetermined by law. Law, not as a provider of solution and results, but as demanding to open a dialogue and the process that the result of which can vary case by case. Sometimes it can achieve the expected result by the person with disability. In other cases, the request proves to be impossible or too burdensome. The result of reasonable accommodation cannot be pre-established. The law is prescriptive in the sense that it mandates to start a process and fixes some essential rules of the game, but the solution is to be found in dialogue with all the parties involved. What is relevant is that it calls upon all the parties to be creative and sincere in negotiating and finding solution. This is, in my view, an interesting aspect of this legal instrument because it urges the parties to engage in a relationship. The duty holder and the individual seeking for accommodation are expected to work together to develop a mutual understanding of reciprocal needs and constraints and to get to a solution that can be reasonable and sustainable for all the parties. It is based on a paradigm of trust in social relations rather than distrust and coercion. Fourth feature, reasonable accommodation does not overlook the cost, the problem of resources of whatever nature imposed on the duty holder. In fact, it imposes an obligation to accommodate up to undue hardship. These are the words in the convention. The accommodation required by the legislation is qualified as reasonable because it takes into account also the context, the constraints deriving from economic issues and social relations. Indeed, there is no standard definition of what amounted to undue hardship, yet in the case law, especially in Canada and in other jurisdictions, some factors are emerging, like financial costs to an organization, provided they reach a substantial amount, the risks for health and safety of the disabled people or other fellow employees or in general public, and indeed other conflicting rights. The key word here is proportionality between different interests and different needs. The fifth, for example, with the people that have visual impairments, there are cases in which the case law says that it is necessary to remove their driver license, but there are cases, especially at the beginning, at the origin of reasonable accommodation in Canada, that concerned a person that did not have peripheral vision, that the court considered that that was not a good reason to remove the driver license. So you see, it's flexible depending on the situation and on a case-by-case basis. And this brings us to the fifth and final feature of reasonable accommodation, is that it always requires case-by-case solutions rather than general rules and general standards. In fact, disability can hardly be approached with a one-size-fits-all measures. Persons with disability need tailored suits. I don't think that I'm contradicting the previous speaker. I'm just developing on the same idea of this tension between universal rights with appropriate individual measures of implementation. The reason is simple and yet is often overlooked. Matilde Leonardi has insisted in saying and stressing that disability is a continuum. And in fact, the border between disability and functionality is blurred. All people can be located in this continuum, as we have heard. No single person with disability is similar to the next one, nor are the social conditions where she or he lives. Each person with disability is unique and has special needs as well as special capabilities. This condition of people with disability poses a challenge for lawmakers, a big challenge for lawmakers. Because in fact, usually law provides rules for a given category of people, apply regulation to groups. And yet when we deal with people with disability, there are no clear borders between different groups of people. And even if you wanted to put a category of disabled people, each of them are very different. So disability calls for a new approach to legislation. It entails crafting regulation that are flexible enough to accommodate the unique circumstances of each individual cases. For example, I take an example again from the European Court of Human Rights. Disabled people with a psychiatric condition under partial guardianship. It was an Hungarian case. All these people were prevented to vote in any kind of election because of their condition. The court considered that treating people with mental abilities a mental disability as a single group was a questionable classification and concluded that the court could not accept an absolute bar on voting rights applied to any person under partial guardianship, irrespective of his or her actual faculties. This is a big problem for legislator. How can you write a rule able to accommodate, to include a specific unique feature of each single case? But it is interesting because it is a challenge, in my view, that concerns not only the fields of disability, but many other situations. Anyway, from the previous overview and insisting on reasonable accommodation with its 5 features, I think that we have learned that relations are very relevant in disability legislation in 3 different perspectives. First, disability impacts not only for the good or for the bad. We have learned how many things we can learn having in a family a member with disability, but it impacts not only the life of the individuals, but also those of the people surrounding them, parents, siblings, schoolmates, fellow workers. That is why, for example, labor law provides special benefits for parents of children with disability in general, and the law provides benefits for the caregivers or person with disability. Second, the aim of this recent legislation is to advance inclusion, that is, improving the relational life of people with disability, from education to sport, from employment to cultural activity. The quality of the relations that we have learned this morning that a person with disability is able to cultivate can make the difference, as the same person may have entirely different experiences in very relational contexts. To put it bluntly, inclusion and participation is a matter of relation. Thirdly, as we have heard, the cornerstone of disability legislation is reasonable accommodation, which implies a relational approach rather than a rules-based one. All in all, reasonable accommodation is based on a duty of solidarity or shared responsibility of all social actors. Again, it is a matter of relations. I would like to conclude on this note with a few more comments, if I have a few minutes, 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, I will try to go very quickly. Let me read the first words of a book that I consider that changed a little bit my perspective about legislation some years ago. It's a book written by Jennifer Nedelsky, the title of which is Laws, Relations, where she outlines a relational theory of self-autonomy and law. I quote, "Relationships are central to people's life, to who we are, to the capacities we are able to develop, to what we value, what we suffer, and what we enjoy." And she advocates to move relationship from the periphery to the center of legal and political thought and practice. I think that she's right. She's right because we have by far underestimated, even in the legal discourse on human rights, the role of relations. Our legal culture would gain a lot from a reasoning that put relation at the center. But here we face a challenge for the years to come, because even the UN Convention that was so beneficial still insists and reflects, in my view, an individualistic culture of human rights, where human dignity is considered as an equivalent of autonomy and independence, which is important. But especially in the realms of disability, we need to understand and to handle with care independence, self-determination, freedom of choice, and similar concepts, because we cannot equate this concept as a sort of do it on your own, a sort of abandonment. We need to work deeper on this idea of dignity as autonomy. I have some cases, but I don't want to insist on cases because it takes too much time. There are cases of people that are under custody with mental disability problems that committed suicide and were justified by the European courts in the name of autonomy and independence. And there were some important dissenting opinions of some judges saying, be careful, because we cannot overlook the vulnerable situation of these people in order to stress their autonomy. I think that there is a lesson to be learned from these tragic cases for all, not only for people with disability, because it's a matter of realism. Living independently cannot be interpreted as living on our own. Not for nobody. In our contemporary society, nobody is completely independent. As a matter of fact, we live in a state of mutual interdependence. And I think that a good contribution can derive from the reading of the last works by Chiara Giaccardi and Mauro Magatti, where they insist on the idea of interdependence. They do not artificially separate the claim for autonomy and freedom from the need for connection and relationship that are intertwined in the fabric of human experience. We have heard in the previous presentation a number of times repeated the word support. I think that this is a key word. Not people with disability, or in any case, people do not need to be substituted in their duties, in their tasks to be discharged. But in many cases, they need to be supported. We need to work on the idea of autonomy with support, like, for example, we have in many experiences with the support teachers or the amministratore di sostegno, a sort of caretaker, support administrator for the elderly or the people that go through a difficult moment of their life. I think that this is a point that we need to work on. Jennifer Nedelsky and, on the other hand, Chiara Giaccardi and Mauro Magatti helps us to understand that we should not be trapped into the alternative between the individualistic, liberal, autonomy-based idea of human dignity or the communitarian understanding. We have been trapped in the legal culture between these two alternatives. They, on the contrary, work on the idea that the capacity for autonomy can only develop and thrive when fostered by constructive relationships, such as those with partners, teachers, friends, parents, and agents of the state. This is a paradox of human experience. Autonomy requires good relations, not only at the early stages of children's development, but in all ages and in all conditions of life. I think that here there is a lesson that we can learn from the experience of people with disability. As paradoxical as it may sound, in order to be autonomous, we need others. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marta. We now have finally a real time for discussion. We can start with Marta's presentation, but we can also add the others, the other questions that couldn't be. Okay, I have Marcelo and Tom and Stefano and Christoph. Oh, too much. Oh, okay, too many. And concurre. So first, Marcelo.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So pithy and on point. On this seemingly eternal Cartesian binary of individualism, autonomy, and social interdependence. Something uniquely human happens ethnographically on the path to autonomy, and that is anomie, the loss of the self and its regulation as we pursue the cult of the individual. I think it is fair to say that in the context of the geologic impact that COVID-19 presented to all human systems, we need to pause and reflect more systematically on what happens when we break, as COVID did, this is a claim, the we, the us. Because when we speak about the scaffolds, the supports that are at the center of the emergence of the person as a fundamental unit of analysis, the problem of the lost self in the pursuit of autonomy creates a fundamental crisis in human connection. COVID, I think, is the most powerful instance of, particularly for children and youth, a topic that I will return to in my own presentation. We are facing extraordinary, maybe unprecedented endeavors to reconstruct the self in the other, the conceptual project of that great past academician, Paul Ricoeur. Thank
you. Do you want?
We can collect all the...
This is a great suggestion, thank you. So the next was Tom. Tom, yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentations this morning. I think we have two characterizations. We have an individual human rights, CRPD, ICF characterization, in which disabled people are individuals, and we demand reasonable accommodation, and that will enable us to flourish. But we also have, and this is where I was very pleased with Professor Carapia's conclusion, we have a need to support people who are not going to be benefited by reasonable accommodation. So in UK, employment for disabled people, it's not no longer is half of that for non-disabled people. It is moved up. So we are minimizing the disability employment gap. But still, people with intellectual disabilities are employed something like 7%, 6%, whereas for many, it's much, much higher. For non-disabled people, it's much, much higher. I want to give you an example. My flight was 2 hours late yesterday. I was here at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. For me, that was fine. I am physically disabled. I was helped to my seat. I was helped off the plane 2 hours late. I was in my wheelchair. I had a wonderful driver, thank you very much, provided by you. But there was another family that were not supported in that way because their son had autism. He had never traveled. The idea of a 2-hour delay for him could be he would take off all his clothes. He would have a meltdown. So I was reasonably accommodated, but he was not. Because I can cope with the 2-hour delay. I just read my book by Pope Francis. I'm up on the game. But he was not. Luckily, because we saw the family when we arrived, he slept. His parents were the answer to prayer. But the point remains that people like me, people who are physically impaired, people who are blind, people even who have autism but average ability, will be liberated by reasonable accommodation. But we will still have others, as obviously we have just heard from Professor Katabia, who are not liberated. And Catholic social teaching is all about supporting the weakest. Our Pope is about the poorest, the weakest. The trouble is, as Baroness Hollins has stated, the way that we help people is not necessarily the way that we include people. So what I'm trying to say is that reasonable accommodation is necessary, but not sufficient. There will be some people like my friend on a plane who will not be benefited. And therefore, as a society, as a species, we need, as a community, we need to support those people. And that demands a different emphasis. I think that the human rights enterprise is great, but it's very individualistic. So we must have a recognition, an involvement, which is inclusive, not separate. As Baroness Hollins has said, not separate orphanages, but inclusive. So all of the wonderful motivations of Catholic social teaching need to be met in an inclusive way, so that we are at the table. So I'd refer you to Hebrews 12:13. This is a social model in the Bible. Make a level path for my feet, it says in English at least, so that the lame be not disabled. Make a level path for my feet so that the lame be not disabled. But in making a level path for my feet, we must remember that we are all different. And some people, that is not enough. We do not want to make things worse by a lack of reasonable accommodation, for sure, but we need to recognize that some people need extra. They need support to be included. The emphasis in this conference is on inclusion. And I want to say that reasonable accommodation is not enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient for inclusion. Thank you.
Yes, the next was Stefanos.
Thank you. Thank you, Marta. During your presentation, at a certain point, you raised the following question. How is it possible for legislation that could take care of the individual cases, individual situations? Don't you think that a possible venue to answer this type of question, which is very relevant, is to go back to the old idea of the distinction between justice and fairness? As you know, already Cicero distinguished in his days justitia and equitas. And he said not always what is just is also fair. And the fairness is what the Greek people called it epikeia. We have to take into consideration the individual situation of the singular person. So my question is, according to you, why in the legal studies areas, of course there are exceptions, as always, this aspect is not taken into consideration? And people, legal scholars, keep on insisting on finding out the optimal level of justice, which is ridiculous, because the optimal level of justice not necessarily is fair. In other words, does not take into consideration. In fact, it was John Rawls who wrote the book, Justice as Fairness and Not. Thank you.
Christoph? Yeah.
I don't think we are here to complain. In my understanding, we are a body on a mission. We want to bring about policy change such that the justified needs of people with disability get a higher chance to be fulfilled. Therefore, I think we should spend more energy on what my econ colleagues would probably call the political economy of bringing things to the fore, to the attention of is not pointless. If you look at the development over some decades of the human rights discourse, it has brought to a point where for a government, it's politically impossible to say they are against human rights. So if we can bring them to a point where it becomes politically impossible to say you're not in favor of the weakest, we already have achieved something. Still, there will be a cost. It will mean that some people will have to give up on things they otherwise would be able to have. And therefore, I think we should think harder about deals. So how can we sell better protection of those who need more help to those who seemingly do not need? And here I think the most positive thing that we have talked about in this morning is a more inclusive definition of what disability means. Because we are living in aging population. Not only does this mean that most of us will become disabled at some point of our life, it even means that due to the demographic change, those who are not disabled will become a smaller and smaller part of society. So already in the more wealthier societies, like mine or best of my understanding also Italy, we don't have enough people to do all the jobs that must be done. And therefore, making it understood to policymakers that this is not a gift to some people who need something, but that this is a way of bringing the entire economy forward, might actually provide what the political scientists would probably call a window of opportunity, a chance to sell this to policy.
Yes, then we have Kokunre and Vittorio. Well, perhaps Vittorio. Okay, Kokun.
Thank you very much. All the presentations since this morning have been very exciting and illuminating to me. I just worry about the inertia of discourse. And by this, I mean that some of the things that we say in conferences and in discussion are things that are sitting individually in different disciplines and across forms of indigenous knowledge. And because we sit separately most of the time and only occasionally come together, we discover or rediscover the wheel where we could have gone so far, reaping the versatile discourses and engineering solutions. I worry about that fact because some of the things that we now call relationality, and we call these things the kinds of things that the human is embodied, are things that are out there called in other settings ubuntu. Even though there has always been a polarization between individuality and communitarianism in extreme ways, there are various forms of articulating this that are already out there. But because we have traditions of gathering in specific spaces, we have not explored these things. And it's as if we need to find a new alternative to a university, or the kinds of discourse that bring us together, so that we are up to speed with the nature of what life demands of the thinking space. Because actually, I think that there is inertia in the way that we generate solutions for a changing world, when in fact all of us, if we had clever ways of designing a discourse, we could have come to specific solutions much quicker. I don't even want to articulate the many elements of this that I've observed here, but I just worry about when are we going to reflect about these institutions that are holding discourse in terms of generating solutions that are in some sort of speed. Even AI, we rely on AI much more than what is needed of us to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Per, for this reflection. And then Vittorio, please.
Thank you very much for this brilliant lectures this morning. I have a question to Marta. Marta, you rightly said at the end of your paper that one of the issues that is discussed with regard to handicapped people, we heard this morning that for a long time persons with mental disturbance were shut off in a way that was very detrimental to them. The justification that you, for example, put people under control was that they could harm other people. And then there was another type of justification that they could harm themselves, like the classic case is someone is in a serious depression. And in fact, when you speak with psychiatrists, you find two schools. Some psychiatrists say we don't have a right to prevent a person from committing suicide. Who are we who have to decide whether a person who is enduring long depression should not commit suicide? And others who say, no, the person who is in a depression is not able to make any responsible decision, and therefore we have not only the right, but a moral duty to try to prevent them from committing suicide. And I was very sympathetic with your position that seems to foster the second answer. I can tell you once a very wise answer that was given to me by a psychiatrist who was of the second school. He tries to prevent people from committing suicide in psychiatric hospitals. And he told me, you know, sometimes when people are really very, very bad off, I ask myself, do I have the right to do so? But then I tell to myself, based on a lot of experience, if someone does not commit only once or twice an attempt to suicide, but is really determined, I cannot stop him or her. So they will do it anyway. And since I know that they will then finally get their will, whenever I can stop it, I have a duty and I do stop it. But this leads now to my question. In your very rich paper, which you could not present for obvious reasons, you skipped a session, which I found very interesting. And that's, of course, the philosophical issue. How do we define how do we define handicap? And you included the issue whether people, for example, who have a certain responsibility for their being disabled to do certain things, namely alcoholics or drug addicts, should be treated. And you mentioned that in Canada, in countries like Canada, the treatment is very different from a country like the United States of America. And what I would like to hear from the colleagues here connected is, do you think, I myself tend to think so, and I will explain you why, that people who have a certain responsibility for having brought themselves into disablement cannot have the same rights as people who are victims of an accident, of a genetic combination for which we have no responsibility whatsoever. And the reason why I think that we must differentiate between the two is exactly the fact that I do not think that you have a right to commit suicide, and so you also do not have a right to destroy your own correct functioning as long as it is given to you. So the person who harms another person must be punished for that, but a person who harms himself or herself and brings themselves then in a situation where they need special attention should also get some negative reaction. And I would like to hear what you, as an eminent jurist, think on this position.
Yeah, well, I have a reaction here by Matilde. So first we are going to let some time to Pier Paolo to put his question, and then Matilde, and finally, Marta, we have to answer before we leave. Yeah.
Thank you, Ana Marta. I appreciate, Marta, very much your presentation, particularly because of your reference to the relationality issue implied in dealing. Thank you. But my question is that we have to ask more than interdependence. It's important to recognize interdependence of people, whatever their abilities and their fragilities, so to balance individuality and community. But don't you think that we can ask for more than that, more than interdependence? And more means to generate relational goods between people. Because in relational goods, there is a co-production of care. There is a symmetry. And in this context of the relational goods, human rights are different from something that you give as a gift, as assistance to the weak. In a symmetrical situation where relational goods are produced, also interdependence disappears because it's a co-dependence, it's not interdependence. Is much more than that. Don't you think so? Thank you very much.
So, Matilde, your point, brief point, please, and then...
I'm just reacting to your point. I think you present things in a quite dangerous manner because you do not put any distinction between the person who have to commit suicide as a result of a sufferance that is also a result of a disease. So then we have the obligation to prevent suicide as long as this is recognized as not a value, but a disease. So then we have to react as a society. And then your question was also concerned the other point. Do we have the need to support those who harm themselves, for example, eating tiramisu all the day and becoming very fat? Do we need to treat these people, or we let them destroy themselves with hundreds of tiramisu? I think that our point is that it's not legislation who can answer. Marta said that at the beginning. Legislation cannot help us to define which are the societal value that we have. In my country, we have the national health system. We think that is our duty to take care of those who have the disease, whether it is as a result of them smoking or eating tiramisu, or because whatever other reason. Other countries think that it's safer to let people be autonomous, independent, and then commit suicide age 35 just because they're depressed or they have anorexia. I think it's not a legislative decision, it's a societal decision. Which society do you want? I don't want a society in which I let people who have been smoking die just because they smoke, but maybe you want. So then it comes into the, no, not you, I'm not saying you, because I know you like tiramisu, but not that much. I'm saying I'm not going to the point in which we define societies on the basis of just legislation, but what are the values of society? And then you open up Ubuntu. I love Ubuntu. That's my South African friends who are saying, do we have a community? Do we still think that society is a community? You are opening other issues. Not only do we take care of those who smoke or drink, are we a society? Do we consider them part of us? Do we need to take care of them? You are opening other questions which are much broader, and legislation cannot help us with that. It's much more. Thank you for that. We can eat tiramisu still in any case, a little.
Yeah. Now I have to, let Marta answer these questions, and later on perhaps, so how we move toward an enabling society, because this is the point.
Thank you, Anna Marta, and thank you for all the interventions that were so illuminating and interesting and gave a great contribution also for the final writing of my paper. Just a few sentences, because the question that has been raised are really very, very broad. First of all, thank you, Tom, for highlighting the limits of reasonable accommodation. But if I properly understand your remarks, I think that the combination between reasonable accommodation and a pattern based on support when needed can do the game a little bit better, maybe, I don't know. But in any case, I will work in this direction, even if in my idea, reasonable accommodation is not just from the physical point of view, but includes other needs that also can involve people with mental disabilities or autism or whatever. To Stefano Zamagni, justice and equity and fairness, I think that we are still living through the remains of the positivistic culture that relies too much on legislation. We have pieces of legislation that are detailed and try to envisage all the situation of social life and so on and so forth, and still falls short, because reality is much more creative than the mind of any kind of legislator. So how can you do, in my view, we should ask legislation, positivistic legislation, a little bit less than we have done so far. Like, for example, asking for clear few basic principles and then leave rooms for spaces that can be adjusted on a case-by-case basis. But this implies trusting in social relations. There is a useful distinction that we can learn from positivistic philosophers like Dworkin. Legislation is not made just by rules, but also by principles. In principle, you have more space to include more diversity, for example. Interesting question. How can we sell in the public discourse more inclusion? The human rights discourse has done a lot. This was a point that I wanted to take after the first wonderful presentation this morning, because we have started this wonderful session this morning listening to a person that was sharing experiences, telling us real stories that are so credible because they are real, they are experienced. And the same was with Tom, with this example in the airplane last night. I think that we need to reflect a little bit more on the relevance of storytelling, not fiction, but real storytelling under two respects. One is put it in the public discourse as part for the reflection of what happens. but also listening to the personal storytelling, because there were two things in the Baroness presentation. The importance also to give space to the protagonist of some situation to be listened in what they live and what is their living experience, how do they feel, what is their what is inside the things that we just can capture from the external point of view. So I think that this idea of sharing experiences, witnesses, and storytelling is something that we think from the methodological point of view we should elaborate a little bit more in order to present, because, or even somebody else this morning was, oh no, it was still you when you said, when you discuss with the legislation about the Down syndrome, tell a person with a Down syndrome that it's better not to be born. I mean, this is the kind of things that are so convincing in my view, when you speak about living experiences. And finally, because really we can talk for hours and hours, but we will have time in the next days. Pierpaolo, we can do a little bit more than simply insisting on interdependence. And I would dare say that we have to rediscover the taste of relations. This is something, because, you know, in our culture, we complain, we are to a point, like has been said with the COVID, we have experienced the detrimental effect, the bad side of an hyper-individualistic culture. But we can move a step forward to disseminate the taste of relations, even if they imply sacrifice and whatever. This was the things that I bring, and I thank all the people that today has decided to share their own experience this morning, because I think that speaking about how beautiful can be, how rich can be, how tasty can be to live through good relations, even if they do not fit the standard pattern of the social life. So there are many things for which I think that we need to be grateful for this first morning. Thank you so much.
Now I ask Sister Helen that leads the...
So we now need to have a little bit of a change to our program, because, as you know, I have to go later on. And so we're going to anticipate part of our program, which is to do with the recognition of our two honorary academicians. So we will do the first part of this little ceremony now, and then we will have the drink, the toast, and another little part later on, which doesn't require my presence, you see. So, but before we start the ceremony, I would just like to say an important thing. We need to produce a final statement. We always produce a final statement. So what we're going to do, because I would normally be the person sort of fielding this, I've asked Pierpaolo, who did a very good final statement at the last plenary, and also Fabio, who's our expert in the area of sociology of disability, if they would be two people who receive comments. Now, Gabriella is going to send you a message with their emails, because the really useful thing for them would be if they could have something written down from you, especially things to do with actions. You know, Baroness Hollins was talking about some, you know, that could be put together in some kind of call, some kind of, you know, next step, something like this, you know, dealing with the frontiers where we are now. We may need a bit more text than that, but I think this is the crucial part of the final statement. It also goes, as we know, to other parts of the Vatican. It's watched by other people. So I think this practical aspect of the final statement is very important. So if you want to send other things, please do. But I think this is a crucial part. So you will get an email from Gabriella with their email addresses in it, and I ask you to send then your ideas for the final statement, which will be discussed in the last discussion session before the closed session, so when everybody is still here in the meeting.
The message will be from Alexander, not Gabriella.
Oh, sorry, Alessandro. So,
From
yeah.
Alessandro.
Okay, Alessandro will send you the message. Okay, so now we will move into our little ceremony. So the part that we will do now is we will listen to two short laudatio, that's the plural, a laudatio, first of all, from Martin Guzman in honor of Joseph Stiglitz. We will do in the order, alphabetical order of our two honorary academicians. And then we will hand over to Father Albino Barrera, who will do the laudatio for Professor Stefano Tamagni. And then we will invite the two honorary academicians to come into the center of the room with myself and the Cardinal, and we will officially award them with their pergamena, their certificates, and we will have the proper photos. You know, it's just like a wedding, it's that sort of thing. And then that will be the first part of the ceremony. Then we'll have the second part with their guests who are coming, see this evening, in the time we originally agreed to have this ceremony. So there will be a sharing with the guests at that point. So please, let me hand over to Martin to make the first laudatio.
Thank you, Sister Helen. Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Many already recognize a most promising future for the young economist when Joe Stiglitz, at the age of 36, won the John Bates Clark Medal. This is an award given by the American Economic Association to an economist under 40 years old who is deemed to have made significant contributions to economic thought and knowledge. No hesitation at the presentation of the medal. Stiglitz is beyond compare among younger economists for the range and variety of his theoretical achievements, as well as for their vigor and their liveliness. Contemporary economic theory is crisscrossed with his footprints. One distinctive feature of this prestigious prize, second only to the Nobel Award, is that its recipients generally move on to win the Nobel Prize itself. And sure enough, Joe Stiglitz lived up to that tradition when he subsequently jointly won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2001 for his work on the theory of markets with asymmetric information. Today, Joe Stiglitz is required reading for the economics of information, microeconomics, macroeconomics, and other fields all over the world. Joseph Stiglitz reached the pinnacle of the academic world with innumerable publications, including dozens of influential books. He's cited heavily in academic publications, and he's the founder of the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which today ranks among the most important academic economic journals. Not surprisingly, he has been a much sought advisor to presidents of various countries, including the United States, having served as the 17th chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, President Bill Clinton's first term. This service was interrupted by his appointment as a senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank from 1997 to 2000, at a time when this multilateral institution was rethinking many of its poverty alleviation programs. And one cannot talk of Joseph Stiglitz without acknowledging his courage and forthrightness at great cost to himself. Despite his top post at the World Bank, he was willing to criticize the policies of its sister institution, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, along with the US government as they pushed programs on developing nations in foreign exchange and sovereign debt crisis. He found that far from providing relief, these neoliberal policies were in fact harming the poor in this insolvent country. He was willing to sacrifice his important post at the World Bank, and similarly, he was scathing in his assessment of the Obama's administration financial rescue plan in response to the 2008-2009 near global financial meltdown, citing it for its efficiencies in helping those who were losing their jobs and homes, while it provided hundreds of billions to the banks that caused the crisis, which still have repercussions today. Reading his writings and looking at his advocacy work, whether it is for a better international tax system or a better intellectual property rights or a better way of assessing economic performance in his work co-chairing the Stiglitz-Sand Fiducie International Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, one can see that such courage and forthrightness were driven by an overriding concern: economic policy in the service of the people, of the poor and the marginalized, economics for the benefit of the people. In both cases, Joseph Stiglitz chose to speak truth to power, regardless of personal cost and political pressure for the sake of those unable to speak up from themselves. It has been said that economics is a powerful discipline, so important and potent that many say it should not be left in the hands of economists alone. And that's right. After all, a single piece of economic advice can affect the lives of millions in consequential ways. In the case of Joseph Stiglitz, the unknown number of people whose lives he had improved will be among his most valuable and enduring legacies. To a great teacher, a great colleague, and for all of this, we can all be thankful. Thank you, Joseph Stiglitz.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, for those very kind words. Let me just say a few things why I've found this academy such a pleasure to be with since 2003, which is a large fraction of the history of the academy. And it's partly, obviously, because of the intellectual rigor that we've seen today as an example of looking at a very important problem from various perspectives, and we'll see this afternoon in the next couple of days. But it's particularly because of echoing one of the remarks that you made, that the economy is supposed to serve society and not the other way around. This is one of the few places where people think about the economy and broader society from that perspective. And the church, in particular, the Pope, the current Pope, has given real leadership in that. That the issues of the day, whether it's debt, intellectual property rights, international tax system, have to be thought of from a moral point of view, looking at it both over time and at the current time. There is no place where people really think about these issues from that consistent perspective. And so I think, it is important for us to pause in our more academic work and our mathematical scribbles with whatever, to think about these issues from that perspective, and hopefully give guidance more broadly to the social sciences and to the global community of how we should be approaching these kinds of problems. So it's been a real pleasure to be with the Pontifical Academy for almost 20 years, more than 20 years now, more than 20 years.
So now I'd like to call on Father Barrera to make the Laudatio for Stefano Tamagni.
So a much sought speaker, Professor Stefano Tamagni, has been honored all over the world with awards, prizes, honorary doctorates, honorary citizenship, and membership in local and national academies of sciences from Latin American countries, Italy, Europe, and several global foundations. These international accolades attest to the quality of his work and the respect he commands in economics, business, political economy, and social ethics. Many claim that economics is a purely positive, non-normative exercise. And this has made collaborative work between theology and economics very difficult. Stefano Zamagni has inspired an entire generation of budding economists and moral theologians, myself included, by showing that there is room for Catholic social thought, even in a pluralistic, secular public square of economic ideas and debate. In his work and writings, Stefano has demonstrated that economics and Catholic social thought are not mutually exclusive. Far being at odds with each other, both can mutually reinforce and improve each other. Stefano could delve into normative economics because he has established his credentials as an accomplished economist, having authored numerous articles, books on the history of economic thought, microeconomics, political economy, and social enterprise. His textbooks are still in use in universities in the EU and beyond. This is not to mention his lengthy teaching career in several universities. His love of students has gone far beyond teaching economics, offering them his wisdom and his encouragement to work for a better world. In Bologna, he was head of the Department of Economics and of the Faculty of Economics in the 1990s. He was also the vice director for many years of Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies at its European campus in Bologna. His engaging activities did not prevent him from being active in family life with his wife, Vera, his daughters, Julia and Elena, who have all achieved brilliant careers, and his 4 now thriving grandchildren. An important contribution of Stefano is his work on the history of economic thought and its insights that can be used for contemporary problems. Pope Benedict notes that globalization, and this is something that had been mentioned earlier, that globalization has made us neighbors, but it has not moved us to treat one another as brothers and sisters. This is Caritas in Veritatis, number 19. Stephanos' work on the civil economy shows how we can move toward a fraternal rather than a purely contractual economy. In contrast to current thinking in political economy of a bilateral axis of market versus government, Stefano has reclaimed from medieval Italian political economy the notion of a trilateral foundation of markets, government, and civil economy. This is a retrieval, reciprocity, and gratuitousness from the Franciscan economy to correct the purely impersonal, transactional relationship characteristic of contemporary markets. Stefano spent much of his efforts in strengthening cooperative and nonprofit enterprises while also contributing to the new Italian legislation for the third sector, or the social economy as the EU prefers to call it. Stefano was a member of the committee that worked on the establishment of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, being appointed to it in 2013 and serving as a member of its council since 2014. In short order, he was asked by Pope Francis to be its president from 2019 to 2023. However, these titles come nowhere near giving even a glimpse into the full measure of his service to the Church, including the presidency of the International Catholic Migration Commission, a Vatican NGO, from 1999 to 2007. In quiet ways that have yet to be made public, he has served as a valued consultant to the last 3 pontiffs, the various dicasteries, and many other offices and officials of the Holy See, especially on matters pertaining to contemporary political economy. Stefano has literally served as a bridge between the academic world of economic theory and policy and the Vatican's socio-economic teachings. For example, we glimpse the impact of his work as Caritatis in Veritate incorporates the ideas of reciprocity and gratuitousness, making them part of modern Catholic social thought's lexicon. We will perhaps get to know more of his unheralded contributions when the history of contemporary social thought is written. For now, we thank Professor Stefano Zamagni, for all that he has done for the Church and for the fields of economics and Catholic social thought.
Thank you very much, Lino. Thank you. Very kind of you. I use a famous expression by Charles Colton, which says, no metaphysician ever felt the deficiency of language so much as the great. I think that applies to my case. So I cannot be grateful. Let me only remind, it is already a bit late, that this academy, it's in a sense a consequence of Centesimus Annus, the famous encyclical letter published by John Paul II, and which was published in 1991. After that, I was asked to be part of the steering committee of this academy. And we worked intensively for a couple of years, and in fact, the academy was established officially later. And then there was we needed, so to speak, an idea in order to give to this academy its proper meaning and direction. And I found that idea in the motto of many medieval academies. The motto in Latin is ubi lux lincet humanitas surgit, which means where light shines, humanity revives. I think that this motto particularly can be applied to this academy. What I learned, what I grasped during this period from the academy is much, much, much more than what I was able to give. So thank you again to all of you, and to you in particular, Albino, for your gracious words that you used for me. Thank you.